Hey everybody, this is Neil Pasricha, and welcome back to chapter 75 of 3 books. It is great to have you here. Welcome back, 3 bookers. And if you were new, settle into your couch tent, grab your headphones for your long stroll, your long drive, your long commute, your long whatever, because this one's going long. We are going long. We are going deep, but we got no ads, no sponsors, no commercials, no interruptions, no book shame, no book guilt, no remorse, people, and we are gonna go deep with one of the deepest minds in the world on today's Worm Moon. Yeah, the full moon, 3rd full moon of the year is officially the Worm Moon. I know it's slightly biased towards the northern hemisphere when those earthworms pop out, when the robins pop out. You remember the other 2 full moons of the year so far that we've had. I'm talking the Wolf Moon in January when we had chapter 71 with Shirley the nurse on the show, and the Snow Moon in February when we had chapter 73 with Humble the poet, the artist, the rapper, the influencer on the show. And now in chapter 75, we have a guy who basically every single writer in the world lines up to laud George Saunders with praise. Laurie Moore says there's no one like him. He is an original, but everyone knows that. Thomas Pynchon says an astoundingly tuned voice, telling just the kinds of stories we need to get us through these times. Zadie Smith says not since Mark Twain has America produced a writer this funny. Dave Egger says George Saunders is a complete original. There is no one better, no one more essential to our national sense of self and sanity. Juno Diaz says few people cut as hard or as deep as George Saunders. And Khalid Husseini says George Saunders makes you feel as though you are reading fiction for the first time. Oh man, wow. Talk about amazing praise from other writers. That's beautiful, from all these other award-winning writers. But the best ever quote I heard about George Saunders actually comes from 2004 from The Believer magazine, where the interviewer said, "The suits called George Saunders' writings stories, but they are actually really soft bodies to wear for a larger experience of life, hollow core person shapes that one can slip on in order to attain amazement. Saunders writes bodies and his readers wear them." Who is this guy? Do you know George Saunders? Are you like, is your jaw dropped and drool slipping out of your lips onto the carpet like I am right now? Do you know about his Man Booker award-winning book, Lincoln in the Bardo, from 2017? Are you aware that he's been awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant and the Guggenheim Fellowship, like the 1-2 kind of sucker punch of like, basically you're one of the smartest people in the world. He's won a Penn Malamud Prize for excellence in the short story. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Every American Academy wants this guy in their academy. Time magazine called him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Of course, he's appeared on the Colbert Report, Late Night with David Letterman, All Things Considered, The Diane Rehm Show. George Saunders was born in Amarillo, Texas, and raised in Oak Forest, Illinois. He has a degree in geophysics and has worked as a geophysical prospector in Indonesia, as a roofer in Chicago, as a doorman in Beverly Hills, and as a technical writer in Rochester. Never mind the fact that since 1997, he has been an esteemed professor of the creative writing program at Syracuse University. And just as a little callback to another 3 books chapter, I will say that our guest back in chapter 69, Cheryl Strayed, who went to Syracuse University, calls George Saunders one of her most important mentors and teachers. And I haven't even mentioned the books yet, guys. Oh, the books. He is the author of 11 books. The short story books just blow my mind, crack my heart open. You gotta read them. Pastoralia, 10th of December. Oh my gosh. And his brand new book, I mean, I can keep going on the book. The brand new one is called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. And you know what? It is the best, I'm going to say it, it is the best book on writing I have ever read. I put it above On Writing by Stephen King. I put it above Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. I just love this book. It is incredible. A Swim in a Pond in a Rain. It just came out a couple months ago. If you are a writer or an aspiring writer, you have to read this book. There's so much to say about George Saunders. I'm almost like, I can't. Here's one thing I wanted to tell you. Okay? When I was in my first ever class of driver's ed when I was 16 years old. The teacher, I remember his name was Ralph. He put these big 4 squares on the board. He said, here's the 4 squares you go through for how you learn how to drive. And I realized that the model he then drew that I remember when I was 16 became the model that I internalized as how you learn how to do anything. You go from don't know, you don't know, you don't know. That's the first box. You don't know, you don't know. You don't know, you suck at driving. You never driven. How would you know it? Then you go to the next box, which is you know you don't know, because you start driving and you suck at it. Same with when you start writing. You guys remember back in chapter 18, David Sedaris said, I read Raymond Carver. I thought I could do it. Turns out I couldn't. That's the thing. When you start doing something, you realize you suck at it. You know you don't know. Then you go to the third box. This is an important box. You go to the box where you know you know. You're staying in your lane. You're not tire punching the curb anymore. You're driving, right? You know you're driving. You are driving. You can do it. And then finally, the very last box is you don't know you know. This is when you arrive home in your driveway and you don't know how you got there, even though you just drove a 45-minute commute home that you've driven 1,000 times. Because you don't know you know. That you go to like kind of the unconsciously conscious kind of part of the box. And why do I mention that little framework right now? Because I kept thinking about it as I was interviewing George Saunders. Most people who can write this well or who are this prominent as an artist or in anything in life, you know, the executive at your company that is an incredible leader, right? The person who can sing better than anybody else. Well, they can't teach it. They can just do it, right? Because they're in that fourth box. They're in that fourth and final box. They don't know they know. It's hard to teach. But George Saunders has somehow simultaneously managed to both achieve this incredibly high bar of writerly brilliance. Don't take it from me. Take it from MacArthur. Take it from Guggenheim. Take it from the academies. Take it from all these awards, okay? And yet he is somehow he somehow molded his mind to hang out in that third box where you know. And why is that important? Because then he can teach. And I kept poking at that amazing mind throughout this conversation. If you want to be a better writer, this thing is for you. It is a masterclass. I found it to be a masterclass for myself. I hope you find it too, on so many things, including the computer we're trapped inside of, reading as a life project, how we actually process reality, practicing Buddhism, the world as a corrective force, how to deliver payoff, how to stay grounded in the face of success, cultivating a love of literature and children, harnessing our shadow selves, quieting mental rumination, how to aim our spigots, and much, much more. I love you guys. I love this community. I love Three Bookers. I love the love I'm feeling. You know what? I'm going to try something right now. Before we jump into chapter 75 with George Saunders, and I want you to get cozy. I want you to get comfortable. Are you comfortable? I'm comfortable. I am wearing gray sweatpants. I am wearing an orange sweatshirt. I am wearing warm socks. I got a green sweater over my sweatshirt because I want to be extra cozy. I want to be extra cozy to listen to this thing. I want to be super comfortable. Get comfortable, guys. I'm going to read you the first half of a letter I just received. Why am I going to read you the first half as we get into George Saunders? Well, I'll tell you why. Because it's the love in this community, and the first half also was all the compliments. The second half of the letter, which I'll read in the end of the podcast club, way back at the end of the show. You guys know we have 3 clubs for 3 books listeners. End of the podcast club, cover to cover club, and of course the secret club, which I can't tell you more about. I'll read you the constructive stuff. That is very, very valuable and important. And then we will get into the Gong discussion after that. Dear Neil, with the growing popularity of 3 books, I'm sure you get plenty of feedback from people telling you how much they love the show. This is no exception. I'm not normally a fan mail person, but for some time now, I have had Write to Neil on my to-do list. We are on a first-name basis, you and I. I discovered 3 books by accident. It all started when I read a brief article about Dr. Jen Gunter. Wanting to learn more about her, I searched for podcasts and I found only 2 results. Chapter 41 of 3 books and one other interview. In fairness to Jen Gunter, I'm sure she has many other shows, but I just didn't look any further. I took some interesting nuggets away from the 3 books chapter, but what really struck me was your podcast. I was intrigued. I got my introduction to Jen, but I quickly shifted to wanting to know more about 3 books. I admit, I am not a faithful podcast listener. I sample here and there, but I never really commit to any, so I scanned the 3 books chapters and I decided to listen to a couple that had names I recognized. I started with chapter 61, Temple Grandin, and then I went to chapter 37 with Malcolm Gladwell, and then I went back to chapter 5 with Gretchen Rubin, and then I was curious to go back to the very first chapter to see where this all started. Your values and desires for the podcast resonate with me. No ads, 2-channel recording, no book guilt, no book shame, and so on. So then I went to chapter 6 with Judy Blume, then chapter 9 with Dave Barry, and then I was only going to do a few more, but then I learned about other chapters, you referenced them, and then I had no idea who Seth Godin was, but one reviewer said, although Seth Godin was really a long chapter, it was worth every minute, and I'm like, come on, 2 hours with this guy I don't know? But I decided to give Seth Godin a try, and the reviewer was right, and I shared that chapter with so many people. Chapter 3 with Seth Godin took me to chapter 7 with Vishwas Agrawal, and then, by then, I knew I had to start at the beginning and go 1 chapter at a time. I'm hooked. I listen to podcasts when I get ready in the morning, when I work around the house, but mostly when I go for walks. You are keeping me active, Neil. I have shared the show with my husband, with my daughter, with our friends, with our family, with anyone who will listen. I have actually recently read several books from the top 1,000, and I've added many more to my to-read list. I have learned about some really fascinating people from your show, and I'm no longer limiting myself to those names I recognize only. I appreciate and I learn from every chapter. The letter goes on, including some really good, juicy, constructive stuff. I will conclude this letter in the end of the podcast club after we listen to the magnificent mind of George Saunders. I'm excited for this one. Let me kind of step back, retreat, dissipate into the corner now, and let's head over to upstate New York to a basement with dogs barking upstairs, and let us hang out with a true genius. I am thrilled to present to you Chapter 75 with the one and only George Saunders. Let's flip the page to Chapter 75 now. Okay, I just pressed record. Hi, George.
Hi, Neil.
And are you in New York right now?
Yes, I'm in Oneonta, New
shed?
York. I'm actually in my basement because I have to be. We're up in the woods and I'm on satellite, so I have to be always plugged into Ethernet. So I'm down here in my kind of weight room.
Nice. I looked up on a map yesterday because I'm in Toronto, Canada, and I kind of looked up whereabouts-ish you are, where I thought you would be, and I was like, oh, we're like the same latitude, and I never felt a kinship necessarily with people at the same latitude as me, but like you probably are experiencing the same similar weather. And I was like, that's an undiscovered relationship, kinship. You're a specialist in kinship. I was like, people of the same latitude, people of the same longitude, there's something to that. There's some similarity that we might experience.
No, it's true. We've been living out in California, and we got a weather report from a friend out there the other day, and it's 72. And here, it's been snowing since Thanksgiving. And I thought it's really different. It's really different to have been in this kind of Chicago-esque winter for 3 months now. It's a different mindset than we'd have out in California.
Yeah, Chicago-esque. I love that. Well, George, thank you so much for coming on 3 Books. As you know, this podcast is by and for book lovers, writers, makers, sellers, and librarians. And I thought to kind of kick us off today and give us a bit of like an oral kind of scenescape, I'd play back to you 3 of your quotes you've said about books or reading or writing. I'm just going to offer these up to you. And if you feel like explaining, expanding, or elucidating on them a little bit, that would be wonderful. Are you cool if I just kick us off?
I could deny them.
Yeah. It wasn't me. 2015 Late Show with Stephen Colbert. You said prose, when it's done right, it's like empathy training wheels.
Agree. Yeah, I agree with that.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's something, I think you have to be a little careful about it because it's obviously not a cure-all. And, there's been prose for a long time, really good prose for a long time, and there's still been chaos and all that. But I think when I read a good story, I always just feel a little more awake to things, a little more involved, a little more enthusiastic about the whole project of being alive. And especially in a short story that, like these Russian ones that I've been writing about, it just, kind of reminds you that it's possible to feel somebody else's pain or bliss or whatever. And that, in a sense, what it does is it just gives you a little poke and says, okay, all those people, walking around out there, they're actually as real as you are, even though that kind of flies in the face of the way things feel. So I think that's one thing fiction can do. I think it's maybe a little bit dangerous to get too wrapped up in that, because fiction works in a lot of different ways, and we should never, make it a slave to our sort of moralistic expectations about it. But I think we also kind of do ourselves a disservice if we don't acknowledge that as one of the things that fiction can really do. And, it's been doing it a long time. And I'd say it's one of those kind of finger in the dike things that have been helping people, not totally self-destruct over the ages.
Yeah, totally. It reminds me of one of the origin quotes of this actual podcast, which is George R.R. Martin: "A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. ... The man who never reads lives only one."
Right, exactly. It's just a way, if you think of it scientifically, it's kind of a way of artificially enhancing the number of data sources you have to draw on. And, if you believe, as I do, that our, our sensory apparatus is kind of a Darwinian miracle, but it's got some built-in design flaws, which is it goes out and it takes all this data and says, oh, that's a duck, or that's a dog, or whatever it is.
Right.
And that's
the
important. Labeling. It's important, and it's essential, but it's also kind of distortive. So one of the things I guess we should be desperately trying to do so is not to live in a diluted state. It is to get more information, more data from different viewpoints than the one that we just happen to be trapped inside of.
Yes, I love that. I've just taken that birding pandemic hobby hashtag, like classic cliche. And I'm like, wandering around looking for like Cooper's hawk. And my friend's like, they're trying to rename the Cooper's hawk because apparently, Cooper was like some bigot from 200 years ago or so. I don't know if that's true for any Cooper fans out there, but like, I was just like, I say to my friend Alec, I'm like, but what did Cooper Hawks call themselves? Like, I was like, who are they to them? And like, what, this bizarre labeling is like, and then you get kind of walking around in the forest looking for birds, and you're like, you kind of get lost in it. But you seem to let me go there a little bit right now, and I put that over to you. Is that, are we the only species that attempts, both for a huge benefit of communicating and interacting, giving people different like picture images, etc., but also as to our own detriment, do we oversimplify and stuff too complex of things into too small of boxes too often?
I think we do, but I think it's probably not just us. I think I've been reading this book by Lisa Feldman Barrett called How Emotions Work or something like that. But the idea, she's saying that basically brain science is telling us that that's just what the brain does. It does it before you even want to do it. It makes a scale model of what's going on moment to moment so fast, and then it modifies it with sensory input. And supposedly this happens from the back of the brain to the front, as I understand it. So that kind of, I expect that a wolf does the same thing. A wolf is running through the woods and it goes, oh, prey. It doesn't say it in words, but it recognizes the aforementioned duck as edible, and so I don't think we can, disavow it. We wouldn't want to. Otherwise, if you imagine us without some kind of inner conceptualizing, it would just be a blaze of inchoate motion. I don't know what it would even be. But as you're implying, you have to take the, you have to look at the downside, so we make these concepts. I guess the error comes in the split second when you think that conceptual soup that the brain is giving us as an approximation is quote unquote reality. I mean, that's also part of the game, is you have to assume that that's an actual bus coming toward you, but I do think part of the challenge of being a full person is to be aware of the computer you're trapped inside of, sort of, that the brain doesn't have an operating manual, but if it did, it would tell us to be a little careful. And I think it would also tell us that a lot of the misery that we cause here comes out of that mistaking of the apparent for the actual, and in other words, what that really means is where you don't have the proper level of humility as we, act and so on.
Yeah, I remember seeing that scene in Jurassic Park when I was like 13 years old, and they said if you don't move, the Tyrannosaurus Rex can't see you. And like, I was like, "Whoa, that's a stupid animal." And then to your point, though, we see that kind of stuff. This animal sees in black and white. But yeah, we don't have the ability, or until you kind of put it to us like that, to see the gaps we have in our own understanding of things.
Yeah.
That is really beautiful. Prose, when it's done right, is like empathy training wheels. The first quote. The second quote of yours comes from page 85 of your new book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, which is wonderful. Unfortunately, I always stumble over the title, so I was like looking at it right now, this big purple hardcover right beside me. Sorry. You said on page 85, if you closely observe your reading mind, you'll find that as you encounter an excess in a story, some non-normative aspect, you enter into a transactional relationship with the writer.
Yeah. So, if you have, in the moment when Kafka says, Gregor Samsa awoke to find he'd been transformed into a beetle, or whatever that line is, you don't go, oh, bullshit, and throw it across the room. You kind of go, okay, I note that is not something that's ever happened to me exactly. Although I have been hung over, but no. But, then you say, okay, so I'll accept that, Franz. I'll accept this notion. And our working assumption now is that you sort of have to make that worthwhile. You have to justify the excess that you've just committed. And so my thought is that basically every story does that. I say, Beethoven walked into the room, and in your mind you go, no, I didn't. Or go, oh, okay, this is one of those historical novels about Beethoven. Oh my God. So, if that's a sincere reaction on your part, then I, as the writer, should have anticipated that. And now I'm going to make it okay with you somehow. I'm going to justify the excess, or you could say I'm going to exploit the slight discomfort that we've got going between us. And I think without that idea, you can't really. Every story is imperfect from the minute you start to tell it. Partly related to the first question, why are stories imperfect? Well, because our understanding is imperfect. But a good story isn't flawless. It doesn't fail to offend or discomfort the reader. It offends, discomforts, thrills, whatever, and then capitalizes on that. So that, to me, that way of thinking of stories as a writer makes it much more fun and workable. If you get yourself, as I often do, cornered when writing a story, where I'm like, I don't know how to finish this. I don't know how it could possibly finish. You could actually read that as great news, because like Houdini, you've put yourself in an impossible position. And if you do get out of it, it's going to be wonderful, but none of that happens in a story that doesn't have these sort of defects and problems, because no story has none of those.
Right. I love is that a dog barking in the background?
Yeah, that's our dog, Kai. she's upstairs, and nice. She doesn't like it when we're apart.
Oh, I love it. I'm sorry. If you want to have Kai in the room with you, I've had many podcasts on the show where there's dogs in the background. I find it creates a nice texture, so feel free. No,
I'd love to, but she's a little older, and I don't think she can get down these stairs. So we'll just have to listen to her from the distance.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you know what the word that comes to my mind as I hear you speak so eloquently, George, about this concept of this transactional is like the word payoff. Like the word payoff always comes into my head. And I find that when I read so many of your stories, I reread Victory Lap for probably the third or fourth time last night, and it gave me that same thing where as I start reading the story, I have no idea where it's going. I don't know who this character is. I don't know what she's talking about, but I know because I know it's you, and there's payoff. And then I compare that to, like, sorry to say this, but like the TV series Lost, where like I got to the very last episode and I was like, I wanted to like not only punch my TV screen, but like burn my DVDs and disavow having ever watched the show, because they didn't tie up all the loose ends. They made so many deals with me and they never came through on them. So is this like this word payoff, if I'm right here, how do you as a writer, and I don't mean you, George, but like how does a writer like make sure that they deliver on that, or am I misunderstanding you a little bit on it?
No,
and you can
that's a perfect understanding. I think the first thing is to recognize that every writer is going to understand this concept differently. But for me, I'm pretty happy with the kind of, payoff idea. And I think the thought would be that It's related to the idea that of low randomness in a story. So, if I if I have a 9-page story and you've read the first 3, then we're already on a pretty narrow path together. The story can't go blundering off in some random direction. The second 2/3 or the latter 2/3 have to respond to the first part. That's kind of implicit in the bargain. Another, maybe a more positive way of saying it is, you in the early pages, you unearth something, or you bring something out into the light, or you ask a question, or you cause a question to be asked. Then really the fun of it is just to, or what I always say is you threw a bunch of bowling pins in the air, and the reader and the writer both know that they're up there. Now the beauty is they might not be able to articulate them that early. They're kind of, they're complicated bowling pins, and they're multiplying, and when they're up in the air and they're turning into bananas and stuff. So they'll just be all the things that are kind of in that imaginary cartoon bubble over your head as you're reading. And again, none of this has to be articulated. It's just happening. Then you know that the job is in the, say second half of the story is to catch those pins, to somehow, you might say, get payoff or acknowledge their existence, or somehow turn to the reader and go, yeah, I have the same pins in the air that you do. So I think that's kind of part of the contract of the whole thing. In the same way that if you were on a car trip with a friend, and something got brought up the first day that was a little awkward or had a lot of potential energy or whatever, a perfectly structured trip is one in which that thing comes back and gets addressed, or almost like a, at a concert when those big balloons are floating around, it comes down and it gets hit and it goes back up, so that issue gets acknowledged and heightened, So that's all part of the internal dynamics of a story, I think.
This is partly what makes me always so disappointed in like real life conversations. I mean, how often do you go out? Well, how often do you go up to somebody, at a party, say, kind of pre-pandemic vision here, and you just sort of float out something? I don't know if you do this too. I'm sure you do. And you just float out something just to see like where they want to go with this conversation. And I find that, when someone's into it, we can go pretty far and take the conversation in nice, fun directions. And if they're not, then you sort of just wander around the party, like wondering when you can leave. I feel, when you can get back into a book or something that is going to have closure, not lost, when you can get back to that TV show that you're gripped with or whatever it is. Do you feel this too? And how do you navigate that feeling?
Well, I think that's another
normal
aspect.
Life.
No, that's another aspect of the way in which the reading project is actually a life project. And what I mean is that when I'm writing and you're reading, or vice versa, there's a kind of an experiment being done with presence. Like, okay, so when I'm rewriting especially, how present can I be in the text? How not in denial or not in a state of inattention can I be? And for me, that means rewriting it many, many, many times, because I'm not that attentive in real life. But, with iteration, I can become pretty attentive, or appear to be. Likewise, on your end, if you're reading and you're listening to music and you're looking out the window and then you're not really attentive to the text, and you're missing a lot of the signals that I've very fastidiously put in there. So I think at the best level, being an artist has something to do with cultivating one's ability to stay attentive, to come to attention quicker, and to stay there by any means necessary. And we have other words for that. I mean, it's presence, it's intelligence. I think if a text is really, if a writer's really attentive to her reader, the reader feels that she's in the presence of someone intelligent. Wit is another good descriptor. Intensity, undeniability. But I think for me, that's been the coolest thing about a life in writing is I was not a particularly attentive young person. I was kind of energetic for sure, very egotistical, very driven, very performative, kind of a little bit of a show off, And I still am all those things. I heard you use
the word neurotic in a few interviews.
Sure,
a little bit.
Sure. What I mean by that is just self-centered, everything. When you think that you're the center of everything, it induces nerves. You're responsible for the entire conduct of the universe. But so I would say that through writing, I at least learned one thing, which is that it's possible to move in the direction of the opposite of all those things. You actually can become, at least momentarily, more attentive, less neurotic, whatever. So again, it's not that it's totally transformative, not at all. In person, I'm probably much like I was 30 years ago, more stooped. But you can, in the moment of writing, you can go, oh, that version of the paragraph is more attentive than the one I just had. So, that just tells us that progress is possible. It doesn't mean you're there. It just means that it's possible, which is sort of an innately hopeful thing.
And I love the way you also kind of like, my son came up to me the other day and said, a drop of water is stronger than a rock. I was like, what do you mean? And I guess he had just learned at school, kind of age 5, that like a drop of water kind of hammering on a rock forever, changes the shape of a rock, and the way you illustrate your editing process reminds me of that. You make it sound so, when you say iteratively hundreds of, you make it sound like anyone can do it if they just kept dropping on the rock.
I think theoretically that's true, but there's something more, something kind of complicated about it, because, okay, this method of revision I'm talking about has to do with what I call in the book micro choices. So you go through a paragraph and you just change to the, or you change somebody's name, or maybe you do a bigger thing. You cut 5 words out of it, and you're doing this over and over and over many weeks, months. And the theory is then, like that rock, it slowly changes shape and becomes more intelligent, more witty, more whatever. But of course, that's contingent on those choices being good ones. And it's also contingent on the choices sort of consistently moving the thing in a certain direction. And I know that when I was younger, that wasn't the case. It was the changes were kind of, 1, scattershot, 2, they were often informed by an intellectual or conceptual agenda, which made them not really organic. Now it feels like those changes are somehow responding to what's already come before in the story in a complicated way. So I think, so then in that, when I was younger, it was a very neurotic feeling, because it felt like a Rubik's Cube, but the colors kept changing, so that's not very fun. It's really frustrating, actually. So I think maybe what happened to me over the years is that I just got it to where the quality of those micro choices was a little more directed, or a little less random, or something like that. So it's not, I think it's true that anyone's writing can improve by revision, but the question is on what basis are you revising? That's the $1 million question.
Maybe to push that metaphor a tiny bit further, just fun to kind of play around with you. It's like you got it so that the cadence of the drop, the cadence of the drop, the amount of the water, the angle that it was dropping, like, that's kind of stuff, as opposed to a young writer, a flood, or it washes away, or, it doesn't hit the rock, it doesn't strike the rock in the center. A lot of it's maybe about kind of getting that piston of sorts, or that kind of hammering thing kind of working right. Yeah,
and maybe I might take even one step further, which is to say, I think for me anyway, that it's not, the part I have to leave out of it is the planning. Like, in other words, not to say, okay, if I put the water on the rock at this angle, such and such will happen. I know some people that do write that way, but for me, it's more like, and this here the metaphor totally falls apart, but as if you said, okay, I'm going to adjust this, whatever it is, adjust this spigot going get onto the rock in such a way that it feels really cool to me. And I'm going to trust that when the water hits that rock, it's going to eventually do some good. So that's a little more complicated. But at the same time, when you talk about adjusting the spigot, in the sense of prose, there are some guidelines for me that I can articulate, which has to do with efficiency. It has to do with, what I think Eddie Van Halen called it the Brown sound, meaning you don't know why you want it that way, but you just do. There's some feeling of, that's the Brown sound. So there is some, that might be the only thing I've learned all these years. There's a suite of feelings that come up when I'm writing well that I recognize as being symptomatic of having the spigot in the right setting. We're going pretty far with that one.
Yeah. 2004, The Believer, you said, I believe in efficiency, action, clarity, velocity. And that phrase, adjust the spigot so it feels good to me. I love that. Thank you, George. Your third and final quote to kind of set the scenescape here today is, I aspire to write stuff that takes into account the fact that we are all dying. Again, from The Believer in 2004. I aspire to write stuff that takes into account the fact that we are all dying.
Yeah. I've heard this. Somebody, I can't remember which writer said this, but somebody said, and this is way too high a standard, and I think it'd be a total like writer's block recipe. But imagine that your story is being read to somebody who's standing on a ledge about to jump. Now that's silly, but let's soften that and say, imagine, just imagine that your stuff is being read by somebody far away who's having a little trouble, or who is feeling alone or whatever. In other words, really, that's a way of saying I don't want to write something that's just decorative or trivial, but I want it I want my stories to speak to someone after someone they care about has passed away, or after a breakup, or So basically, I want to write something kind of durable. Durable in the face of what? Well, this is a temporary thing we're going through here, and so all that. I just don't want it. I don't want my writing to be trivial.
Yeah. Well, when you said the fact that we were all dying, I actually I didn't picture that. Actually, I didn't. When you say that metaphor of the person kind of standing on the edge of a bridge or a cliff, and I kind of get that in a sense because your writing is so gripping that, of course, sentence by sentence, the person, regardless of what's going on, they're like wants to hear what happens next. They're sort of wooed into the story more than whatever else is happening. Kind of like in like a movie scene, where the guy kind of talking the guy off a ledge is like just gets them onto like a totally other topic. Like, you like baseball, Hank? Hank, you don't want to do that. You like baseball? You like the Yankees? You know what I mean? Like that kind of like pulling them into a story about something else. But I thought what you meant by the quote, which I guess I was way off, is just that because what I try to focus on in the stuff I do is thinking about the fact that you got 30,000 days of life. What reminds you of that temporariness to enable better quality living. Like I thought that's what you.
Yeah, no, that's much better. That's much better than the guy on the ledge. Yeah, that's exactly right.
No. I wasn't trying to. I thought they were two different things.
No, I think they're probably in some way related. But I love that idea that you're somehow part of the Darwinian packaging that we arrive wrapped in is that we get up and like still George, okay, yeah, clouds, trees, birds, yeah. It's all like of course it's normalized, and I think that's what one of the ways that our mind maintains continuity is to say same old life, but. As you're saying, that someday that won't be true at all. Someday it'll be like, holy shit, birds, trees. So I think that's one thing that literature can do in a very modest way. It can just kind of give you a little pop in the head and make you, oh yeah, you haven't blown it yet, but you also haven't fully capitalized on it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that because it makes me think, and you had shared in I think a 2003 interview with the New York Times how you took off on a plane from Chicago to Syracuse, and you didn't know what happened, but suddenly like smoke started coming out of the plane and the lights went dark, and then you did a U-turn, and like the plane was like, the captain was like, buckle up, we're going down, and turns out you guys had a safe landing, but you hit a bunch of geese. I think Canada geese, not to blame my country here, but and then you had this like heightened awareness of life for a few days, and that's what it makes me think of, that you shared that story, kind of like a near-death experience, I guess.
Yeah, and that was, you go through that, and I would say you're probably seeing things more truly after that than for example, I'm seeing it right now. You're like, oh, this is, and actually one of the things that got into my bloodstream that day and hasn't left is just that weird sense of, that, okay, so we all know that death is coming in the abstract, but when it actually is coming, you think it really is amazing. How you see I saw in relief, from stark relief, how much I really believe that I'm here for good, that I'm central to everything and I'm not ever going to die. All you guys are, but I'm going to be still standing. There's a beautiful section.
What do you mean? Sorry, what do you mean by that, George? Sorry, what do you mean that you saw that? How did you see that?
Well, I remember sitting there, and it had happened so fast, and it was so clearly urgent by the tone in the captain's voice, and also by the fact that we were kind of plummeting, we're dropping pretty fast, not in free fall, but fast. And I just thought, I was sitting there, how the seats are right there in your face, and I'm like, oh shit, I have to get out of this.
You said a 14-year-old boy next to you, right? I think.
Yeah. I was in the middle seat of a three, I think, or maybe just two. But I looked at that seat and like, oh shit, I have to get out of this body now, and that's what's going to do it to me. That seat. And then there's this 14-year-old boy was to the side, and I was so. I joke about it now, but it's kind of terrible. I was so scared and so trapped in that fear that I don't know if I could even remember my name at that point. It was really harrowing. And at some point the little boy said, "Sir, is this supposed to be happening?" And it kind of like snapped me out of myself. I'm like, oh, so of course I just went, yeah, totally normal, and calmed him down a little bit, I think. And maybe in the process, calm myself down a little bit. But I think that, that's a true moment when you realize that, you're not, you and your loves and your attachments and your accomplishments are absolutely, conditional. And not only might they go away, they definitely will, So all that, and again, it's good fodder for talking about, but I can tell you that feeling left, and I think maybe as it has to, you have to go back to normal, but to come back to a writing, maybe that's one thing that writing and reading can do is just, mimic that a little bit. Just go, okay, here's the story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, about a guy who goes through exactly that process. That might just warm that feeling up a little bit, Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by the phrase, I have to get out of this body now? How do you define I? When you say I, what do you mean?
Well, in that moment, it just meant, oh God, this is going to hurt, because
oh, okay.
You can't hit the ground at that speed and not and stay in there, But I think that's
I thought you meant you saw yourself as a conscience or something, or
not. I wasn't anything that sublime. It was just like, shit, that's going to hurt. But I think that's what we're talking about is, and I'm not. I mean, this is beyond my pay grade, but this idea that the way I see it is probably, you get born and your mind starts going, your monkey mind starts ruminating and talking about yourself and admiring yourself and sometimes castigating yourself and all that thinking about, that we do very naturally in that Darwinian way we talked about earlier. That thinking creates this thing that we call self, and it's a total fiction. It's not to be found anywhere. It's just as I see it now, it's a result of the ruminative process, and also the result of the fact that we have nerve endings that only go so far, and they report back limited data, and then therefore we go, oh, George, he's the best. So that's, I think that's
a name you didn't even give yourself.
Right. Right.
You were decreed to be George.
Yeah. So I think that's the thing. Now that I have had that idea intellectually for a very long time, but I don't sadly have it viscerally yet. I had it briefly in that plane and a couple other times in my life, but that I think is that's the struggle. And, most of us will not get that idea fully. That would be really amazing if we did. But you can understand that death is going to be something like that idea coming into sharper and sharper focus and then being fully realized.
Mm-hmm.
Ouch.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I could listen to you talk all day. These tunnels that your mind goes down to explore these ideas is so intoxicating, and so it makes it so exciting for me to transition us now into talking about your three most formative books. So for each book, George, if you don't mind, I'll give the listener kind of a 60-second overview with the goal of having them feel like they're holding the book in a bookstore. And then I'll pass things over to you and say to tell us about your relationship with the book. And then we'll kick into maybe a few related questions about that.
Okay, sure.
Does that work?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, great. So your first most formative book is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, published in 1843 by Chapman and Hall. Charles Dickens, of course, was born in England in 1812 and lived until 1870, a very, very, very famous English writer and social critic. I am holding a small penguin, kind of the classic orange spine soft cover. Mine says The Christmas Books on the front. This book has A Christmas Carol and the chimes in it. Published in the 1972 over in Penguin, England. The cover is the very famous kind of engraving colored in of Ebenezer Scrooge in like all white pajamas looking up at like the giant ghost of Christmas present wearing a huge green kind of open-chested um, covering of some sort, bare feet over like a whole tray of sausages and food and bananas and all this stuff, with a torch up above his hand, kind of like an Olympian. The back says, A Christmas Carol has become an inseparable part of the English Christmas, which Dickens might almost be said to have invented. In time, it moved its readers to a consciousness of the terrible plight of the poor in the hungry 40s. File this one, Dewey Decimal Heads, under 823.8 for Victorian period English fiction, 1837 to 1900. And George, please tell us about your relationship with A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens.
Sure. I have this beautiful edition. Penguin Classics has put out these cloth-bound editions. So I have it's called A Christmas Carol and Other Christmas Writings. I think I first became aware of the story as a little kid when there was a guy named Mr. Magoo, who was a cartoon character, and they did a Mr. Magoo version of A Christmas Carol. So, and it was terrifying. It was a really, ghosts and this metaphysical story. And so for many years, I thought that was it. I thought that was the origin. And then I think probably, I'm not sure when, probably in college, my mom gave me the complete Dickens or something, and it was in there, and I read it. And it's, and now I think it's so, the Muppets did a version, George C. Scott did a version, but it's really, if you haven't
My
read
version is Mickey Mouse.
Oh, really? I haven't seen it.
I thought it was a Mickey Mouse, like Disney Sunday night at 6 p.m. That's like totally the same as you, but for Mr. Magoo, I had Mickey Mouse for like 20 years in my head. Right.
Mr. Magoo was voiced by the guy who does, what's his name? Thurston Howell on Gilligan's Island. So he would go like, "Oh, spirit, spare me." But I taught a class. Actually, all three of the books here today are from a class I taught at Syracuse called The Short Novel. And I taught it, and it was amazing because most people, I think, think they know the story. But if you haven't actually read it, I think it's just a masterpiece. Structurally, it's incredible. There's everything that's brought up very casually in the first third gets totally, exploited or used beautifully in the last third. The whole thing with the ghost is really brilliant way of talking about memory and all that. So it's a really and line to line is beautiful. It's Dickens. It seemed like he, sometimes I think I read that this happened with Dennis Johnson and Jesus' Son, where sometimes you have a project that's kind of a side project, and you just, for some reason, you drop your normal stance, and it's very natural, and it feels that way to me that Dickens wrote it in that mode. And there's just beautiful moral things in here that are kind of like a little corny. The book has a little bit of a sentimental streak, but at the same time, you're interrogating that, and you go, yeah, but actually, it's not far off. Like this is. Can I just read you a little section here that I love?
Please.
He goes. So the ghost of Scrooge's business partner has come to haunt him and tell him that if he doesn't change his ways, he's going to be, as this ghost Marley is. Doomed to wander the world eternally, wrapped in these heavy metal chains made of cash boxes because he loves money. The ghost says to him, "Oh, captive bound and double ironed, not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all." Let me do that again. "Oh, captive bound and double ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit, working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." So that's pretty good.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh, how was this book formative to you? You mentioned the Mr. Magoo and how you read it in college with the complete Dickens. So, and I know you use it in your course. So how so? Like how, and I love Kai in the background chiming in here.
That's a different dog. That's our daughter's dog. I think it's just, I wasn't somebody who was, I was an engineering student, so I hadn't really read very widely. But this book just hit me in the gut. It just felt so truthful and so impassioned and directly located on, what I was kind of thinking about and worrying about in real life, which is, how do we live? So I think it was, and I would say probably too. Sorry about all the dog activity up there. We have deer. We have deer up here, and so they get revved up. But so I think it was just. I think probably too. I must have recognized the structural beauty of the thing because it's so efficient, And if you study the ending, there's a lot of scenes that you'd like to see that Dickens omits, but you feel them there anyway. And so I think it might have been an early example of feeling that even somebody who was a bit of a dope at that point in terms of reading could feel the efficiency of it.
Yeah. I mean, even the first sentence, Marley was dead, to begin with.
Right.
Period.
Yeah.
And this section too reminds me of that efficiency. It's page 79 of my book and not yours. It's in the first of the three spirits where the first spirit or ghost takes Scrooge back to see his, I guess, first or only girlfriend kind of breaking up with him. You fear the world too much, she answered gently. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you.
Yeah,
and she's saying, you've left me for a golden idol. And I thought, that's interesting. I mean, you figure so much into your work, George, about society and culture and kind of how we live and how we could and should and maybe do and what might happen. But one thing I don't hear you talk about much, and it might just be that I haven't read all of your stuff, is it's just kind of money. And I thought that'd be interesting to explore. Part of what you always talk about as a writer is remaining grounded. You have this famous piece in kind of Fresno where you lived amongst a group of homeless folks and you kind of have been right in the Trump rallies and you remain so accessible and you are, which is, I think it comes through your writing so well. At the same time, you're one of the most decorated authors alive. I mean, you've been publicly declared a genius. You won the banned book. So how do you retain that sense of connectedness or groundedness or humility that's so important as an ingredient that you espouse as a writer? And I agree with you in the face of kind of commercial success. How do you think about that?
I think it's just low self-esteem. That's still, it doesn't really, I don't care what they say. I know I'm shit. I mean, I think that's really, but something about that passage that struck me, I don't forget it. So his, Nell, I think her name is, she says to him, another has displaced me, and she allows him to break off the marriage. And then later, in terms of efficiency, we see her husband years later saying, "Oh, I saw your old friend, Mr. Scrooge. He looks terrible, still alone." But elsewhere in the book, in the Ghost of Christmas Past, lets us see Scrooge as a little boy, and he's so lonely. His dad has rejected him. I think maybe his mother died in childbirth, giving birth to Scrooge, I think. So he's lonely. And you see that for him, all this accruing of wealth is kind of compensatory. He knows what it's like to be alone and to be overlooked. So he compensates. So Dickens has made such a beautiful picture of this grouchy, horrible guy, Scrooge, that we're told to hate, who abandoned true love. Oh, we hate him even more. And then you go, yeah, but also we see a perfect mechanism for why people do get caught up in this idea of gain. It's a pretty close second if you feel inadequate in other ways. And the world is kind of terrifying, and it will crush you if you don't have enough money. So it's a beautiful system where by the end of the book, you feel very tender towards Scrooge and very hopeful that he'll change. And then the book becomes this massive contemplation of the question of, okay, if someone, if any of us, hopes to change, how does that actually happen? It doesn't happen. We know it doesn't happen just by willing it. And in Scrooge's case, what happens is the ghost
showing you the past.
The past, the future, and the past, the present, and the future, which is also how we would change. You don't really change. Sometimes you might just remember a better nature that you had in another time, which is what happens to Scrooge. There's a beautiful scene where he remembers being a very young worker, and his boss was this really generous guy named Fezziwig, and Fezziwig throws these big parties. And Scrooge, who we only have seen as a total grouch, hates everything, is not only shown as a young man joyfully dancing, but he's shown as the old guy watching his young self joyfully dancing. So, it's so vast.
Yeah. And I think I hear in there, although please slap me around and tell me I'm way off here, that part of the reason you can remain humble is because you were loved as a child, in a sense. Like you're not compensating for anything through commercial success. You're writing to write, not for. Is that? Am I misunderstanding you?
No, I was definitely loved very much as a kid, and I have a real sense of gratitude because I'm have that. I think in some ways the way that your parents make you feel as a kid is the way that you then assume the universe must be afterwards. So if your parents have been abusive and withholding, you go, oh, the universe is abusive and withholding. And in my case, if your parents were generous and liked you and accommodated you and took pleasure in you, then you assume that the universe is like that too. But I also think part of the process of being a writer is to keep reading. And honestly, when I read Dickens, or these Russian writers, I just honestly feel like what I've done is okay, but we're in a fallen time. We're in a fallen time, so a schmuck like me can get a little attention. But when I hold up my work against, say, these great stories in this Russian book by Tolstoy or Chekhov or A Christmas Carol, it's a genuine. People always say, I'm humbled, which usually means they're not, But in this case, when you read those works, it's genuinely humbling if you have any semblance of taste, which I like to think I do. So I think part of it, and this is where teaching comes in, if I go out on the road and get a bunch of praise, like anybody, I inflate. It's like eating beans. You're going to get farty. That's the way it is. But then to come back and teach and put yourself in the face of these truly great masterpieces, it just clears the deck. And okay, so let's not be stupid and misunderstand.
But how does that amazing? That's amazing. I totally relate to that. I read your stuff and I read David Mitchell or David Sedaris, and I'm humbled about my own over and over again. But at the same time, how does that square with actually doing it? To go out there, we're putting our names on books and shipping them out to people, and we want, isn't there something that's the opposite by kind of even taking a swing at this over and over again?
Yeah, I think, in so many things, Neil, it seems to me like the trick is to set the dial in the middle somewhere. Like, to say, well, yeah, okay, so actually my stuff pales in comparison with the work of the masters. On the other hand, I might have something to offer, and how am I going to find out if I don't try? And maybe in the end, it's kind of like a feeling of, well, it's more fun to try it than not, So I think you can, for me, you can one can operate in the middle there, and also being very sensitive to to when things are out of whack. If I start to think too highly of myself, I want to correct that. If I start to think too poorly of myself, I want to correct that. So I guess that would be the, and I guess maybe truly at the core of that is the idea that someday I'm going to get up there in the big leagues with those guys. But I'm not going to do it by neurotically bewailing my present inadequacy.
Yeah. This is amazing. What a great way to describe the feeling, because of course we rely on that, or it's as fuel. It's nitro, so you have to use it. but also don't overuse it and so on. George, so much of this book is about kindness, right? We see the metamorphosis of Scrooge from the famous Ebenezer Scrooge, tightwad, work till late on Christmas Eve, etc. And at the end, he's like, he's buying the biggest turkey and giving it to the Bob Cratchit's family, and he's making donations, and he's befriending Tiny Tim and all this stuff. It's like, makes me think so much about your work because, you have, of course, delivered the very famous commencement speech. Congratulations, by the way, all about kindness. And I was speaking to a future guest on 3 books named Edward Packard, and Edward Packard is 90. He is the creator of Choose Your Own Adventure. And I was telling him that I'm going to interview you, and he said, interesting. He had just finished reading the New York Times book review of A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, and he said, I get the impression from the reviewer that George Saunders, like Harold Bloom, believes that reading literature makes you a more expansive, generous person, maybe a kinder person. One would think that would be the case, Edward wrote to me. Reading, especially reading great literature, should make you wiser. And if you're wiser, you'll be more expansive and generous. But is this really the case? Are people steeped in literature, academics, critics, serious writers, really on average more expansive and generous than regular folks? I don't get that impression from the book I'm about to finish, Deirdre Bare's Parisian Lives, Samuel Beckett, Simone de Beauvoir, and Me, a memoir, in which she describes her encounters with dozens of people who might be called literary elites. See also Paul Johnson, Intellectuals, from Marx and Tolstoy to Sartre and Chomsky, 2007, which is the book that first got me thinking about what seems to be a paradox. Why aren't intellectuals, on average, nicer people? And so that question to you comes from a future guest of the show, just to get a little time bendy here. I'd love to offer it up to you and see what you think.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think I would say in my own experience, when I come out of a Chekhov story, I definitely feel more expansive and generous. Now, those not necessarily nicer, but expansive in the sense that my view has gone temporarily out of my own constriction. I've been somebody else for a few pages. Generous in the sense that I am slightly more inclined to believe that those suckers out there, those other people are as real as I am. That kind of feeling. It's temporary, and it's brief. And I don't think I would ever claim that it makes, that reading sort of is the magic wand that makes everybody nicer. It might also be that people who are inclined to be intellectuals are struggling. That's why they find it. They're struggling with their own limitations. But it's an interesting thing. It might also be that it makes you a little miserable. When I'm working, sometimes it's really fun, and other times it's just kind of ritual self-torment. You get stuck at a certain place and you can't believe it. So it's a deep question. But I don't really mean to imply that literature is this thing that transforms everybody. I think it's more like maybe more like good conversation or good food. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of respite, a little bit of a, again, as we said earlier, a little bit of reminder that there's additional generosity and expansiveness available to you. It's certainly not a cure-all or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you often talk about the versions of self, maybe just lets you see more elements and sides of yourself to know what's out there, or to sample new emotions, or to test new feelings and see if you like them or not. And it might not change you, but it might make you see a side of yourself that you then lean into. And so it's so hard to quantify, but I love the question from Edward, because
I do too. Yes, it's true. Yeah, because I do have, I sometimes have a bit of a hyperbolic quality. I can sometimes get a little worked up about it. The one thing I think is true, though, is that, when you're, in a certain way, there's a sacramental function to art. So what I mean by that is, when I was a kid and I would go to Catholic church, go to mass, I'd come out kind of elated, resolving to be better and to be more like Christ, and feeling confident that was possible, that I could be, more present and so on. And then, it always faded away. But the sacramental part of it is to say, okay, so if I went into church in state A and came out, condition A, and came out in condition F, which felt to me better, more adaptable, more loving, more whatever, then, And even if that state F doesn't stay, it tells us that the transformation is possible. So that's, to me, a vastly hopeful thing, which is to say, you're not trapped in whoever you happen to be at the moment. Maybe it's a form of Buddhist impermanence idea that if you're in a state at the moment, not only will you probably change, there's no way in hell you could stay in that state. It just doesn't seem possible, So I think that's another thing that reading and writing can remind us that you're not, you're Neil, but you're almost like lowercase Neil, you're not uppercase Neil. You're not stuck in who you are, something like that.
Well, and also the other phrase that jumped out at me from what you just said is the phrase fade away. If it fades away, it fades away. I've got young kids right now. I know you've got two girls, they've kind of grown up quite a bit, but you probably remember, and I'm sure you do with yourself too, is like I'm often struck by the fact that my kids are going to remember nothing of what, because they're at the age where I have no memories. I have no memories of being one or two or three or four or five. So I'm like, they're going to remember none of this breakfast I made, I'm killing myself for this construction paper thing. They're not going to. And then I'm like, but then my wife's like, no, it's in there. It's in there. You can't remember, but it's in there.
It's
so I'm like, the fade away
retained.
Point.
Yeah.
Yeah. To the point where you even called out just now at age 62, I think, the feeling of walking out of church in Chicago, 40, 50 years ago, maybe. And it's something stuck in there, even though it faded away. I don't know. Maybe the fading away part we could have fun playing with.
Yeah. I think everything does. And so, in some ultimate way, I think, I notice, maybe more and more as I get older, I notice the habit of mind that kind of wants to, catalog and cash in. So in other words, when I was younger, I would think, this has been a really great day. This is one for the memory book. I'll remember this one, as if that was something substantial. Well, in fact, depending on what happens in the next 15 years or 5 years or 1 year, all of my treasured memories will just will be not accessible to me or anybody else. So that's I still haven't quite got that one through my head, but I think it's clearly true that anything we sort of set aside to wallow in, let's say, you get a book out and you get a nice review. Well, that whole system, the book, the review, your enjoyment of it, that's all contingent. It's all of those things are on the way out. So it's kind of weird, in a way, like it sometimes makes you feel like a lack of footing. Like, well, wait a minute, if that's the case, what am I doing and why am I doing it? But that's a good, that's a good question to ask.
Yeah. And you said maybe it's like the Buddhist state of impermanence. And I know you've been, so open about your, Buddhist, is it religion or is that the right word?
Practice, I guess.
Buddhist practice, and for someone from a distance, I grew up. So my dad is from Amritsar, India. My mom is from Nairobi, Kenya. Both Indian. Her family left Lahore, India, kind of before the partition to help build the railroad out in East Africa. Her family fled East Africa.
Wow.
During the Idi Amin crisis of a neighboring Uganda, and my dad came to Canada because they needed physics teachers, and he was the only one that had learned physics when they wanted to introduce teachers. So he got over here. He went back to England one summer. Some family friends introduced them. They had one date. My dad performed the hamburger test on my mom, which means he ordered a hamburger and just to check if she was vegetarian or not. She was not vegetarian. She ate the hamburger. They got married 2 weeks later.
Wow, amazing.
The wedding itself was their second date.
Wow.
He saw her next at the wedding.
Wow.
He brought her back to Canada. She had no family around at all. They're both technically Hindu. My mom much more so practicing than my dad, the astrophysicist, who kind of wasn't that keen on kind of blue guys with six arms. And not to disparage that. I'm just saying he was not oriented that way. He was more oriented towards F equals MA and stuff like that. And so I grew up in Oshawa, which is a suburb about an hour east of Toronto, kind of almost 100% white community through the 1970s and 80s and 90s. And the way I was exposed to religion or faith was kind of like I wasn't. Like it was like we drove to Toronto to a temple a couple times, went to United Church a couple times. I had one friend that was, this friend is Jewish, and it was kind of like I sat in sort of like a slow simmering stew of everything. And this quote unquote kind of diversity of the town I grew up in was kind of like sort of like, what version of white were you? Like Polish or Ukrainian or German or, and so now I'm 41 and I'm like, I feel dumb asking, but like, what's Buddhism like to you? Like, what is, how would you describe it to someone who is spiritual, but it sounds like you have a very interesting practice and faith. And do you mind opening that up just for even a few seconds to tell us about what that looks like for you?
Sure. Well, I mean, I just always want to I'm really a beginner. Like I've been doing it for a long time, but I haven't done it with the intensity that I wish I had because of writing probably, So this is all kind of just, fellow traveler stuff, but to me,
that's exactly what we want though. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my doorway in is just to say that, I guess it starts with the realization that, like we talked about earlier, you're in this package of mind, body, and it's that thing that's making you think that you're in existence. And so there could be ways of poking at that a little bit and saying, okay, well, can somebody please, or not somebody, can I be given a copy of the owner's manual of this thing that I'm in, So in other words, you can say, well, I just had a thought that the day was lovely. I thought, okay, now what is that exactly? Where is that thought? It's nowhere. It's just something that sort of seemed to have occurred to you. So I guess what it is for me is the idea that you actually could take a second and look at the functioning system you're inside of, and that would be called, roughly speaking, meditation. And then the other part of it that I found really beautiful, and again, I've just scratched at the surface like a kind of a dummy, is this idea we talked about that you're inside a temporary phenomenon that has tendencies. So in my case, mine has a bit of a tendency of negation, a kind of satirical, distancing, snarky, humorous resistance, so I'll say. And that's been me from the time I was a little kid, along with other things, sentimentality and you could list them, but the point is it's a temporary package that I was granted at birth. It's not a prison, and the way I learned this was just having a period of where I was practicing more than I am now, and just noticing slightly a difference between what I'll call me and that group of tendencies. So it's almost like if you imagine two circles, they just pulled apart a little bit, and I could see a little tiny wedge there of difference. So that means that my innate tendency of mind, which I always thought was me, is just temporary, And I noticed that there were, in that little wedge, there was a lot of positive things that were there as well. So that was kind of amazing, and so that to me is something. That's what I have, learned from being a very amateur Buddhist practitioner, along with one other thing, which is that there are people who aren't amateurs, who are really dedicated and have spent, I would say, lifetimes, pursuing this stuff, and that they are different. They're different. Their minds. If you want to put it in a Western way, their minds work differently, and I would say they work in a higher state of awareness, just anecdotally or observationally, and that's a tremendous difference. Someone who is getting, let's say, even 20% more data from the world because their mind is 20% quieter. That's a different kind of a person than I am.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned what makes me think of, I've never told this publicly. In 2002, I flew to Japan to visit a friend, and for some reason, I could not go to the bathroom once I arrived. I stopped going to the bathroom, and you know what, George, a day went by. Who cares? 2 days? Who cares? 3 days? I'm starting to get worried. 4 days? I got to go to the hospital. And I'm in Osaka. I don't speak any language. My friend is working. I'm trying to navigate. I get to the hospital, and I luckily have some good travel insurance because they put me, or maybe Japan's just like super awesome healthcare, which it probably is. And I end up in this white room with a guy who I don't speak the language. Of course, he doesn't speak English. I don't speak Japanese. Japan, of course, I believe a predominantly Buddhist country. And he does some tests and he gives me a little drink and he looks at me and very, very broken English, very, very slowly, very, very carefully for like 30 seconds, he says to me, you must, and I can't even, there's no accent coming. I'm not good at accent. He's like, you are ocean. You don't know you are ocean. You land, your stress should be drop in ocean.
Oh, wow.
It's not for you. And I say, so I'm like, it's just in my mind. It's because I, traveling maybe from the first time by myself so far away, I got all tense and I stopped going to the bathroom, and he nods and I said, well, how do I do that? How do I feel like the ocean? He's like, many years. And that was it. And then, he walks out of the room to the next guy. And I was like,
wow.
And I never really pieced that together. I never thought, I honestly have not really thought of that again. Maybe too embarrassed for the first few years to mention it to somebody. But
that's beautiful.
That phrase and little connection made me think of, it solved the problem sort of physiologically, first of all. And then second of all, like that was a little tiny touch point I had with Buddhism to make, I think that's what he was.
It sounds like it. Yeah. No, I think it's just, really the way I don't see it as anything, necessarily mystical or out of step with anything, with science or with writing. It's just saying, we have a lot of systems in place as human beings that are involved with denial. Again, it's probably survival stuff, and I think that for me, what you might call,
just to pause there for a second.
Well, inattentiveness, for example, you're in a situation, but you're anxious. You're thinking, oh my God, these are the wrong pants for the moment or whatever you're thinking. That's a form of denial. You're denying what's actually in front of you because your mind is ruminating, and, all our sense of inadequacy and shame and elation and all those things are somehow, I think, a form of keeping us out of the moment. Or another way of saying it is, the rumination function of our mind takes a lot of energy and it's very important to our survival. But it's blocking out a lot of incoming information. And, if we say, well, the universe is vast and we don't have the wherewithal to understand it, but we can understand it better than we do. And what would have to happen is we'd have to be letting more data in. So, that just means being more aware and less in denial. So for me, any path, like a spiritual or artistic or what personal or humanistic, whatever, it's basically trying to figure out a way for us to get out of denial. And for me, that mostly takes the form of anxiety. I have, not clinical, but I'm pretty high-strung person. So I don't think to me, it's not anything hazy or mystical. It's just like, if you've ever had a good day in your life when you felt really present and available and aware of other people's needs, and you've had a bad day where you're so agitated and distraught or whatever that you weren't, then you put those 2 days side by side, see which one you'd rather be in, really. And then the last part of it is there a way to choose, one over the other? And I think that's what spiritual traditions say. Yeah, there is actually, now the question is which one for you and how do you do it? And do you have the discipline and all that? But to me, it's heartening just to know that, there is some control over the experience we have here. And it all would start with one's mind more than likely.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the meditation component. You've illustrated some, I don't want to call them thought experiments, but just you've illustrated some sort of ways of thinking about life and you-ness. Was there any other things you do as a practice, just as a day-to-day or a week-to-week thing that you sort of insert in your habits or your calendar or your schedule of any kind that brings this faith to life? When you say I used to do it more, what I guess was the it, or what was the thing you used to?
I have a meditation practice that I did, and it's just sort of silly, but there will be times like now where this book is out, or actually also before that when I was writing the book, where somehow that's a negotiable, which is just, that's human nature. You know something's good for you and you don't do it. So it's more, for me, it's more a matter of trying to figure out how to, writing for me is, I love it. And there's something helpful about it. But it takes for me a lot of time, and it pushes out almost everything else. So that's something I'm trying to kind of get a handle on as I get older. It's just like, how do I have to be a little more, have a little more discernment in how I'm arranging the hours of the day.
Interesting. Yeah, I love you sharing that. And I actually am a little bit salivating because I have young children and I do not get to focus on it nearly as much as I want to be. So I'm actually quite excited for the time of my life when I have more time to write, funny as that may sound. George, thank you for letting us take A Christmas Carol and use it as like a bit of a poking stick into a lot of areas of your brain. It's so wonderful to explore these ideas with you. Are you okay if we move on to your second book now?
Sure.
Okay, great. I'd like to share with everybody listening that your second most formative book is Haji Murat, Hadji space Murat, the name of the person, non-fictional character that the book written by Leo Tolstoy is based on. This was published in 1912 after Tolstoy had passed away. I could not find the name of the publishing company. Tolstoy lived from 1828 to 1910 in Russia, born to an aristocratic Russian family, and best known for his novels War and Peace from 1869 and Anna Karenina in 1878, often cited as the pinnacle of realistic fiction. He received nominations for the Nobel Prize in Literature every single year from 1902 to 1906, and for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, 1902, and 1909. The fact that he never won is a major controversy. Filed this book under 891.733 for Russian fiction from 1800 to 1917. Quick summary: in 1851, Leo Tolstoy enlisted in the Russian army. He was sent to the Caucasus, if I said that right, to help defeat the Chechens. During this war, a great Avar chieftain, this is like one of these things I'm going to butcher every word. Avar chieftain Haji Murat broke with the Chechen leader Shamil and fled to the Russians for safety. Months later, while attempting to rescue his family from Shamil's prison, Haji Murat was pursued by those he had betrayed, and after fighting the most heroic battle of his life, was killed. Tolstoy, witness to many of the events leading to Haji Murat's death, set down this story with painstaking accuracy to preserve for future generations the horror, nobility, and destruction inherent in war. George, please tell us about your relationship with Haji Murat by Leo Tolstoy.
Yeah, well, for me, it's more, my interest in this is more kind of cannibalistic and writerly, because it's, I've heard this book described as kind of the compression of, or the sort of summation of everything he learned writing the bigger novels. So it's only, the version I have is short. It's like 140 pages or something. But the way that he goes from scene to scene and the point of view shifts that he does are really reminiscent and maybe even exaggerated versions of what he does in the big books. So if you're a writer and you want to learn about structure and point of view, this is a great little scale model of those big books, and you can see what he does. And it's kind of, I think the effect for me is that he keeps moving around in the story. I haven't counted the point of views, but I'm sure there's dozens that he inhabits. And it's kind of, it results in this kind of holographic picture of what's happened. And it's cross-culturally, the Russians are fighting a war. But Tolstoy, kind of like Shakespeare, he's very happy to get out of the Russian head and go into the other heads. And he major characters, minor characters you never see again. He just quickly pops in these different heads, and in the end, it's kind of I don't know. I think it was kind of a God's eye view. Like this might be what God thinks of us, because Tolstoy doesn't privilege any one narrator. He's although that's a little arguable, but within the tolerance of the book, everybody gets a fair shake, and he's in there. And when he's in there, he's giving you all kinds of information that's very human scaled. Things are, you're actually in another body. So to me, it's a great little distillation of that whole third person omniscient thing that Tolstoy did so beautifully.
You know, it's so interesting you say that, because now that you mention it, yeah, he suddenly flings you. You're in the prisoners' camp. You're in Haji Murad's son's mind, you know, being called to speak to Shamil. You're in Shamil's mind. You're in the Tsar, you know, the Russian kind of leader's mind. You're yes, it's so true. And as a reader, I guess it's partly to our earlier point. It's like it was just an adventure for me, so I didn't actually even see the screws and pinions working as it was happening, other than it was just an enjoyable experience. Murat, of course, you know, it's a non-fictional dude. Like his whole thing is like he's on a quest to save his family. Like he's trying to kind of, you know, you can feel this love for his family. Kind of, he goes and speaks to his captors every single day to like ask about his family's safety. He dies valiantly, you know, trying to rescue his family. He's on a mission to kind of get them out of Shamil's kind of prison camp. It's like all about family. We don't know much about his family, but it's all about family. And it made me think of your acknowledgments, George, of both your most recent book and of 10th of December. You wrote quite a bit about your family. I hope you don't mind me reading a couple sentences of your own acknowledgments back to you. But in 10th of December, you wrote, "Paula, everything worthwhile I've done over the past 25 years has been inspired, selflessly supported, and lovingly informed by your kindness, your advice, and your undying faith. Thank you 1 million times. Somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something really freaking good." So that made me pause. And then in A Swim Upon in the Rain, your most recent book, you wrote, "Most especially, I am deeply grateful to my dear wife, Paula, and our daughters, Caitlin and Alina, and the way we have always been as a family, living and talking and dreaming as if there is no difference between literature and life, and as if devotion to the former can make the latter better." So much to be talked about here, but I might start with, what are the characteristics of a good writer as spouse and writer's spouse? Like my wife Leslie and I were talking about this last night in bed. She's like, you know, ask him this question, because I'm not easy to be around, and I'm curious, and I feel like I've won the lottery, and I have the most amazing wife. She often helps me host the show, and many of our listeners know and love Leslie the way I do. So I feel the same reverence for my spouse, and I believe she likes me too. What makes it work for you guys? And you just mentioned your obsessive writing days. What types of things have worked for you guys, and also with your kids, to create this life of literature that you talk about? I aspire to the same, and so I'm just curious for your wisdom. Is
Leslie a writer also?
No, she's a elementary school teacher, grades 7 and 8, inner city, kids with special needs.
Oh, wonderful.
Massively empathetic soul, and mother to 4 little boys.
Wow. Well, give her my blessings, and my blessings. Let me start over. Give her my greetings, and
I think she'd love your blessings too.
No, I don't have any.
I
don't have that. I don't have that certificate.
I will say I guess
I guess I was going to say bless you for that. That's amazing. No, I mean, I think for one of the things is that Paula has those obsessive writing days too. She's a really wonderful novelist. She had her first book called A Distance Home that was really lovely. So we, you know, we commiserate, and we kind of get up and go to our respective rooms and come out fuming for, you know, or elated or whatever, 4 or 5 hours later. So that we met at Syracuse in the creative writing program. So we always had writing in common, and you know, I think just the kind of a shared sense that it was important, and also I'm
assuming you met when you were both students there.
Yeah, that's right. We did, and we got, you know, maybe not so different from your parents. We got engaged in 3 weeks after we met.
Wow.
Yeah. But I think it just, you know, shared interest. We also both were little kind of spiritual kids. You know, she was engaged in Christianity, and I was also Catholic, you know. And so I think when we first met, that was something that we figured out pretty quickly. We had that interest in common. And then she actually became a Buddhist first, and I copied her, you know. So I think it's that really. It's just that we feel like we're, you know, just, I don't know. I really admire her. I think that's the biggest thing. I really admire her as a person and look up to her. And so, yeah, it's good.
There's that old phrase, you know, a good marriage is one where both people feel like the lucky one.
Yeah.
Makes me think of that. And I love this phrase that you said, you know, living, and especially in regards to your daughters as well, how living and talking and dreaming as if there is no difference between literature and life. What a beautiful and appealing kind of goal as a father and as a parent. My kids love to read. I'm really lucky to be able to say that. We leave books everywhere. They're splayed all over the place. At the same time, I don't know if I'm doing it right. And I'm curious what things you did in your home as the kids were growing up to make literature, I guess, come alive. What did you do in regards to books and reading? How did you think about what books to give them when? Was there anything you did that you can share on creating that sort of that love of literature and having it inform your lives like you do?
I think it was just in the atmosphere. It was clear that Paul and I were really, that's the only thing we were interested in, really. And so I think that got conveyed, probably just through the passion with which we talked about stories, and we'd, see a movie and kind of rip its structure apart or come out all teary-eyed or, move. So I think it was really in the air. I think, and also, there's just the basic genetics. I think both our kids are big, great readers, very intelligent. And so I don't think there was anything in particular that we did. I mean, I think it's probably a pretty resilient quality anyway. I think if a person is a reader, they just are, but, so I think we, was in some ways probably, modeled, a certain devotion to the task. And, I think they could probably see that we didn't always have that much money. And so that was, I think they saw that was a form of devotion, that we're going to teach English no matter what, damn it, But yeah, I don't know. I think at this stage of my life, I'm a little, maybe a little bit more philosophical about the child raising. I think it's looking back, I think I felt I had a lot more influence than I actually did. They come into the world and they're people, and they're going to do what they're going to do. And you can maybe put up some bumpers.
Nature.
Yeah. Do a little judo. I mean, it's probably both, but if they have a certain energy, you can do a little judo and make it easier for them. But I think it's, and also I think we were really lucky. We just got a couple of gems, and it was nothing but fun.
That is beautiful, and does make me worry about my kids knowing nothing about sports and other huge gaps in their lives. Yeah. But so nice to hear that. Also, it was nothing special. It was just in the air like that. Mental health.
Can I say one thing about that? A friend of ours, a dear friend of ours, told us once. She said this thing that really, I wish I'd heard that earlier. She said, "What you don't teach your kids, the world will." And she meant it kindly. If you somehow neglect something or overemphasize something, the world is corrective, and if, as long as they're lucky enough to have friends in a community, that, the rough edges will get taken off.
Ooh, that's nice. It also makes me feel a lot less guilt over how bad of a dad I am.
No, I'm sure you're a wonderful dad. The fact that you're worrying about it is pretty good proof that you're okay.
Oh, well, thanks. I have lots of other issues. I mean, I lose my temper. I sometimes freak out on a 3-year-old and I feel terrible for 5 days. There's lots of things I'm working on, but I do care about it. Another thing I care about is my mental health, and taking it from Haji Murat, so many different mental states on display. They talk openly, about how character seems, and I read some interviews with you. I think 2016 and Image, 2018 Writer's Digest. You sort of, you've mentioned what you've already mentioned today about sort of anxious tendencies, and David Sedaris, who you have a wonderful interview with at the back of 10th of December, and who was our guest back in chapter 18 of this podcast, he openly talks about his OCD. And when I talked to him, he said, he picks up garbage for 9.5 hours a day because he can't not. That's like what he says. I say, I can't not do it. I'm held back by myself. And I read I don't want to call it a eulogy, maybe it was a eulogy, of David Foster Wallace, a writer whose essay inspired this podcast, actually, an essay he wrote called The Nature of the Fun, which is about finding fun things after you've had commercial success, because chasing commercial success totally mutates you and you end up producing shit, is partly what inspired this podcast. And he was obviously really open about, or questionably open, I guess, about his depression and his bipolar. I think the question I'm trying to get at here, and I want to ask it in a gentle way, because I'm asking, of course, for myself, primarily here, but what is your relationship with the version of you who is that kind of anxious overthinker? Of course, that is the person kind of producing this great art. How do you think about taming or wielding your different mental states, and how do you harness your shadow self for the positive while also being very careful and safe and sort of aware of it? I read your wonderful words at David Foster Wallace's Day's funeral, and it made me kind of wonder if I could broach into this topic of observing your mental state and using it both as good and being careful of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of, I don't know, I think that's part of the job, is to say, well, okay, I'll tell you how I imagine it. We're each born with a certain brain/mind. I'm not sure about the distinction, but we have certain mental tendencies. And I would say mine are pretty healthy, with a little bit of, as we said, anxiety and, a little bit of obsessiveness. But basically, I think if you're not in a danger zone, which I don't think I have been, knock on wood, I think then you sort of go, well, this is a thought creating machine. This machine is throwing up thoughts that are somehow particular to that machine that I was born with. And so I don't have to be too attached to them, and I also don't have to disavow them too much. I can just notice them. It's almost like if you're running a lawnmower, over a bunch of books and these different sentences were flying out, okay, so now your lawn is different than my lawn. The sentences fly out. So I think the healthy relation is to say, those aren't me. I don't have to love them. I don't have to hate them. I can just, in terms of writing, I can use them. If I want to make a portrait of a grieving middle-aged widow in Fresno, I can sort of try to access that valence, So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think basically
yes,
see it as,
going.
It's like,
right.
For example, I'm not much of a runner. I can run okay, that's just what I got, I mean, I'm not a sprinter. I can run a little. So the idea that you would feel some kind of pride or shame in that is somehow, so I guess I kind of think of it that way. And in writing, that's really the job, is to use the thought stream that you have in whatever way you want to use it. And then at the same time, at the end, just put it all back on the shelf. These are just thoughts that arise, and you don't have to. Now that's easy to say and hard to do. If I have a certain thought stream, of course you do tend to identify it with yourself. But I think basically I just feel, if our mental processes are basically okay, we should be really grateful, because I think it's pretty clear that it's a physical thing. And there's I just read in Galleys this wonderful book by Donald Antrim that's be coming out next year, I guess. And it's about suicide and depression. And it's just so smart about those kind of things. And so, makes you think that it's just really kind of, it is a luck of the draw at some point what mental processes you're going to get. Yeah. Again, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but.
So let's, no, you are. And I want to poke at one part of it. You're answering it great. And it's really fun to chat about. Let's take the sort of like dangers to yourself kind of part off the table then for now. Mm-hmm. I think I'm the same way. I feel very lucky at the draw. I mean, I lost one of my closest friends to suicide. It's part of the reason I started writing my blog in the first place. It's sort of in some sort of remembrance of him and reflection of him. And anyway, I feel like I'm kind of okay. But, who knows in the future. But then the part my brain goes to is, how do I lean into that stuff? You often talk about sort of exposing the subconscious, but I've heard many, there's that famous Hemingway, write drunk, edit sober. And I know there's other writers that kind of do things to their minds to lean in, whether that's with psychedelics or other Neil Gaiman famously, is like a sensory deprivation type of writer, from what I understand. He talks about like making himself so bored that the thing he's working on is finally ultimately interesting. That's part of what I'm wondering about, because I've got this weird thing in my brain too. You call it a monkey mind. I don't know. monkey might be too evolved for what I've got running around up there all over the place. Dark, weird, sexual, overwhelming. Sometimes I feel like I can channel that. Sometimes I can't. And I'm wondering if you do anything per se to lean into it, or if it's just the opposite, that keeping yourself in pretty good mental health, lets that come out. I guess I'm trying to poke at that a bit.
Well, let me come at it from a different direction, because the way it seems to me is I want to write sober and normal and even banal, because I'm assuming that the reader on the other side will be in that state as well. If you write in some kind of induced state, then you have to hope that the reader is on the same drugs you are. So to me, it's right. No, let's forget all that. And then I also don't really worry too much about all those states. I think they're temporary, manifestations of your mind. But for me, it all comes down to reading the text that I have in front of me that's mine, trying to read it as if I hadn't read it a million times before, which is really a lot of the trick. And then just I always have this metaphor that there's a meter in my head with positive on one side and negative on the other. And as I'm reading my own stuff, pretending I haven't, I'm just watching what that needle's doing. And that's the big thing is, how honest can I be about what the needle's doing? Am I, sort of leaning on it, pushing it into the positive, or maybe I'm tugging it into the negative. But if it goes into the negative, there's a moment there where you just go, okay. And then in that second, a little solution might appear, a cut or a rearrangement or an insertion. For me, it sounds so trivial, but all of the questions you're asking, all that question you asked is contained in that moment of openness to the energy of the text. If the text would prefer you to do A, you do A. If you suddenly get this feeling of wanting to blurt something out in that space, you do it. That I think it's almost like if you had a bunch of wild animals in the next room, and then you had an opening that you could control, and you're like, well, I don't actually need all those wild animals right now. What do I need? Well, you look in the animalless room to see what you need. That's the text. You know what I mean? Like, so I don't, for me, it's, I think I used to kind of think about that stuff. And of course, there's always that mythology that someone should be wild and go to the dark side and come out with some gem. I just don't buy it. For me, it doesn't seem, the times when I've tried it, it didn't work. It seemed stupider than my usual stuff. So for me, so many of these things, we just develop them in order to be productive. And for me, the most productive thing is to say, whatever I know or don't know, whatever is good or bad in me, whatever is powerful is there. But it can only be expressed in the context of a certain point in the text. So my job is to be kind of a gatekeeper and sit there at the door of the text and see what it needs, in the quiet confidence that everything good is going to have to come through that door, if that makes sense. So I think
totally.
Yeah. And also that makes it, and the writers I've known, great writers, they aren't, there are all kinds of different kinds of people, but I think they all share that seriousness of, when you're writing a story, you're not actually proving how amazing you are or how dark or how whatever. You're just proving that you can make a coherent text that draws people in and isn't irrelevant to the business of being alive. That makes sense.
It does. Well, this phrase, openness to the energy of the text, to me, what I want, my brain craves, but of course it can't get there because it's so almost subconscious or spiritual. I've heard you talk about it before, is that, my brain's like, but then how? But how, George? How do you do that? And I've read,
but I can tell you,
Pond in the Rain. So I've heard your words on this topic, but I still at the precipice. That's
One way I think is you just say, okay, I went to a songwriting seminar years ago with this guy, Mike Smith, who wrote a really beautiful story called The Dutchman that Steve Goodman did. And it was just at somebody's house. It was before I'd published anything, and I was kind of really struggling. And he said something that he said, well, what I do is I write a song, and then I summon up the 2 or 3 songs that I love best. And I look at my song and say, why is it not as good as those? Now, to me at the time, that struck me as way too harsh, but I think there's wisdom in it. And what I think he's saying is, if I write a story, the whole move is to read it kind of with the question in mind, where is this letting me down? Where is this? Where is the needle going into the N? Then the kind of circular answer is, well, fix it. So in other words, if I'm reading along, and like I have a story I'm working on now, and I was reading it the other day, and I got to about page 6, and it had been perfect the day before. But when I was reading it yesterday, page 6 seemed to be a little drifty. I could feel this inner reader going, oh boy, come on. Well, so the first step is to go, okay, I just felt that. And the second thing is to go, I bless that feeling. And the third thing is to go, I'm going to see if I can fix it. So I think for me, that's it. It's not, there's not a whole lot of, construction or intention. It's just, you're looking at this little house you're making, and it strikes you that it's asymmetrical and you don't like that. Well, then make it symmetrical.
I love that.
And then from there you can say, well, what constitutes the asymmetry? Why am I feeling that? Then you can fix it. So again, I'm not sure that that's for everybody, but for me, that's partly because those questions are so big and potentially overpowering. Early on, I developed a strategy that I just described to you of keeping the anxiety at bay when I'm working and trusting that the moment-to-moment decisions are where all the gold is.
Yeah, and I love that little model. Feel it, bless it, fix it.
There's a T-shirt in there somewhere.
Yeah, feel it, bless it, fix it. And the blessing is a big part of it, because you could easily say, well, yesterday I like it, so it's fine. But no, you acknowledge and you approve of that. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for letting us dive deep into Haji Murat. How do you say that, by the way? Because I think I'm saying that
I don't
wrong.
know. My version has a D at the end of his name, Haji Murat, but I don't know.
Okay, yeah. I have both the T and the D, and I have a little note that kind of depending on which translation, one of them ended in a D, I guess, and one of them ended in a D. Okay, great. Well, I'd love to transition now to your third and final book, which is another title that I'm probably going to mess up, which is Europeana.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Europeana, A Brief History of the 20th Century by Patrick Urednik. O-U-R with a little V on top of the R, E-D-N-I-K. And the dot on the I is that exontic Q. I don't know what those symbols are called. George, you're going to have to illuminate us. He wrote this book in 2005 from Dalkey Archive Press. Patrick was born in 1957 in Prague, alive today in France. He spent his youth in Prague. In 1984, he emigrated to France, where he worked as a chess consultant and then as a librarian. From 1986 to 1998, he served as editor and head of the literature section of the quarterly L'Autre Europe. In 1982, he was instrumental in founding the Free University of Nulajwe, and he has lectured there since 95. Dewey Decimal Heads, you can file this under 940.5 for history and geography /Europe from 1918 onwards. Told in an informal, mesmerizing voice, Urednik represents the 20th century in all its contradictions and grand illusions, demonstrating that nothing substantial has changed between 1900 and 1999. Humanity is still hopeful for the future and still mired in age-old conflicts. George, tell us about your relationship with Europeana, A Brief History of the 20th Century by Patrick Urednik.
Well, I had a wonderful student and wonderful writer, Adam Levin, who recommended this to me. I think he taught it in to our daughter's class at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and then the recommendation came to me. And it's just a crazy book. I think, as far as I understand, it's all made of actual facts. It's called fiction, but I think what he does is he's just taking an alternative walk through the 20th century, where he's emphasizing different things than are normally emphasized in history books. So, as far as I know, there's nothing in here that's untrue. So, for example, I can just read you the opening. So it's a kind of a walk through the century with a strange emphasis, which makes you see it afresh. The Americans who fell in Normandy in 1944 were tall men, measuring 173 centimeters on average, and if they were laid head to foot, they would measure 38 kilometers. The Germans were tall too, while the tallest of all were the Senegalese Fusiliers in the First World War, who measured 176 centimeters. And so they were sent into battle on the front lines in order to scare the Germans. It was said of the First World War that people in it fell like seeds. And the Russian communists later calculated how much fertilizer a square kilometer of corpses would yield and how much they would save on expensive foreign fertilizers if they used the corpses of traitors and criminals instead of manure. And the English invented the tank, and the Germans invented gas, which is known as Ypirite because the Germans first used it near the town of, I don't know how to pronounce it, Ypres, although apparently that was not true. And was also called mustard because it stung the nose like Dijon mustard, and that was apparently true. And some soldiers who returned home after the war did not want to eat Dijon mustard again. So that's the first page.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Of the three, this is the only ones I sadly couldn't get my hands on a copy of. So hearing you read that, it's just, I kind of see why you like it already, but tell us more about how it was formative to you, or what parts of you did it open up?
Well, it just goes on like that for the whole, 300 pages.
The whole book.
It never flinches, and it never conventionalizes itself, and it never explains itself. And there's no attempt at plot except the natural plot of the 20th century unfolding. And it's unfolding, with your knowledge, quote unquote, knowledge of it in your mind. And this alternative version is running along like a crazy person that starts making a eerie kind of sense. There's a section that talks about the eugenics experiments in America before World War II and how Hitler learned from us and so on. So it's just a trip. And I think it just kind of destabilizes any sense you have that what's happened, in history. So I think for me, it was formative, maybe in the sense that I know that it informed some of the stuff in Lincoln and the Bardo where there would be alternate versions of the same, thing presented in sequence so that the reader didn't really know which of the four versions to believe. And somehow it also plays into this thing we talked about with the Tolstoy, where, there's one point of view that's the conventional history. And there's this one, which is actually, it's equally factual. And the truth is somewhere in the juxtaposition of the two, although it's also, of course, the juxtaposition of the hundreds of thousands of different versions of Europeana that could have been written. So it's kind of a really great sort of palate cleanser, I think. And also, it shows you something about, in a funny way, because there's no characters and there's no real plot, it tells you a lot about character and plot. Because as you're reading it, you feel your mind trying to make a story out of it, trying to detect the agenda of the writer. And one of the triumphs of the book is that you can't. There's no, it never really shows its hand. Yeah, but still, you see your longing for a plot, which is another thing that as writers I think we have to work with. Is that that's almost a human need to, if you're being told a story, to try to make some sense out of it.
Yeah. Wow. So much there. I struggled to find a copy, but partly that's because we're in lockdown. So I have a great supply of so many used bookstores in downtown Toronto, all of which are sadly shuttered at the moment because of COVID. So when those open back up, I'm going to go back hunting for this book. New York Times called this book an annotated Harper's Index that gradually takes the shape of a bizarre narrative, a frenetic tour through the absurdities and horrors of the past century. That jogged into my brain, George, a sentence you said in 2015. You were on Stephen Colbert. It's kind of just before you and him saying that wonderful duet of that song you wrote, which is just beautiful. And you said, in my lifetime, our world has become more material, more analytical, more fact-based, more shareholder-honoring, kind of a gradual shift to the rational side of things. And I think that what we need to understand, our real powerful gifts are love, tenderness, patience, and all that. And so it's possible in a couple generations, those things we grew up on could kind of drift out of the picture. And you said that sentence on Colbert, like kind of in the middle of two jokes that you got, like, it was just like, it just struck me. I was like, whoa, I wrote that sentence down. And now, only 5-6 years ago, the world has become even more that way. I mean, I would argue, certainly the advance of social media algorithms and news algorithms and just algorithms in general mean that we're constantly pulled into this like whirlpool of kind of algorithmic capitalism that just sucks our brains into stuff we can't not look at because we're beholden to our biology, and they certainly know how to kind of make us look at stuff. And I guess my question is, like, you're such a free thinker, something I really admire about you. you grew up in a generation where perhaps it was more possible to do that than it is for kids growing up today in this world I'm describing, and maybe you're describing. What ingredients do you use, or would you recommend your students use to sort of untether themselves a bit mentally, and to live more freely, less encumbered by some of what I feel are the strictures or fasteners that we have kind of all around it? You can't literally live now without entering into endless algorithmic matrices. That's how you get your news. That's how you interact with people. During COVID, that's kind of more most of your social relationships are coming from. It's like, yet I feel this problem with that because it's so capitalistic and ads-based revenue. I was like,
Yeah.
Can you open that up a bit for me? Like,
Well,
crack it open like a walnut and give me your thoughts?
Well, that's I think the big issue of our time. And I guess I would kind of go back to what we said before. I think I'm not inclined to prescribe really, but it seems like the first thing is to, notice it. I watched that documentary called The Social Dilemma, and that really kind of blew my mind. So notice it. You notice what great. You're like with a week off of social media, a week on, just notice it, and then bless your reaction to that. Like, it seems like I'm a little different, like even I was on Facebook just briefly and I didn't really like it at all. And I noticed that I just was becoming a performing monkey, for people I didn't really even know. And I didn't like that feeling. And I also felt like I was squandering my creative energy a little bit. Like the joke I always make is I took years to teach myself to write very slowly for a lot of money. And suddenly I was being offered the chance to write quickly for free, so, but I think that's
not even for free in the services of a tech giant's bottom line.
Yeah. So I think, I could get really preachy on this, but I kind of don't feel like it. But I think that the trick is for everybody to make their own assessment. And I think when people do that, they'll probably get a sense that this is the great toxicity of our time, and it's so seductive, and it feels so much like you're just living into yourself and you're just doing what you want. But I think it's pretty clear from the events of the last few years that this is a pretty dangerous animal that's gotten out of the box. But again, I think the trick is, we're great at analyzing, and we're great at noticing what we do in response to different phenomena. So I think that would be the first thing is just take a look, see what life feels like without it, what life feels like with it. And most of us, I think, are going to end up in some middle ground where you're living under its influence. And you're just marginally more aware of it, and therefore it's beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I talk about this, and I sometimes do get preachy about it, and I say cell phone addiction is real, and I talk about social media addiction. At the same time, here I am with you deleted your Facebook account, and I applaud that. I'm like, I really desperately want to press the button where I delete all this stuff, all my social media, all that stuff. I do feel a bit like it's squandering my creative energy and so on. At the same time, it's like when I release this conversation with George Saunders to the world, it's through social media that I actually have to tell people about it, or no one will listen to it in my mind. I'm like, I have to launch my book through that. I mean, so I feel like it's a bit of a devil in disguise. Like I can't pull. I say this to younger people, teenagers and so on. I'm like, oh yeah, you got to get off social media. You can't sleep with your cell phone. You got the thing open on Snapchat at 2 a.m. in your bed. No wonder you're waking up with a headache and tired. And they say, Neil, you don't understand. Like it's my only connection to my friends. Like it's that'd be the equivalent of saying don't talk to your friends. So I have to. And I don't know if you have grandkids. No, not yet. Or if you ever will or whatever. But I wonder, like for those kids, that's kind of what I'm wondering, because those are the age of my kids now, know. And
I really don't know. I think like so many things, it's fun to live in the land of extreme solution, but mostly we end up living in the middle, where you have to kind of do the best you can with, but and for me, it's fairly selfish that I have a need to I guess I suppose a need to get attention, really, and what I noticed when I was on social media is that I was squandering that need a little bit every day, getting little bits of attention that really wasn't that meaningful. Whereas now that I'm off it, that need sort of wells up, and then I use it in my work. So for me, it's nothing high-minded. It's just kind of functional and pragmatic that I feel happier when I'm not doing it. But like when this book came out and it was all over social media, I'm happy, So this is where but people have always lived in these states. There's never been a time when all the ducks were in the row, and there never will be. So that's the interesting part, is can you maintain some clarity and some benevolence in the face of the fact that you're not living perfectly? That's the hard part.
Ooh, that's good. Can you maintain some, can you say that one more time? That was such a juicy sentence.
Can you maintain some benevolence and clarity in the face of the fact that you're not doing it right? I don't know. I don't even remember. Talk about impermanence.
No, it's great. Well, George, you have let us kind of dive into these 3 formative books. It's been such a pleasure going into them in detail. I was wondering if you had time for a few fast money round questions to close us off today.
I do.
Okay, number 1, hardcover, paperback, audio, or e?
Hardcover.
Cover. Any care to expand? I know it's fast money, but I wonder why you're a hardcover guy.
Hardcover, bought at a local independent bookstore for a little more than I should pay for it.
Nice. Okay. How do you organize your books on your bookshelf?
Completely randomly. There's no logic at all. We've got, it's wherever there's a space.
What is your book lending policy?
I'm happy to do it, unless it's signed. Then I just do it and make sure you get it back to me.
Nice. That's the most generous one we've heard so far. Malcolm Gladwell was famously grudging was his book lending policy earlier on our show. What is your favorite bookstore, living or dead?
There's so many. I really am a big fan of Parnassus in Nashville. We had a great time there, and Ann Patchett is just such a great, defender of literature. And when you go there, you feel so welcome, and so you feel like you're already part of the community, which I really admire.
Nice. Do you have a white whale book or any book you've been chasing the longest in any sense? Either to read or some sort of metaphorically chasing?
Well, I'm reading Don Quixote for the first time. I started it before. Now I'm almost to the end, and so that's been kind of a big one. And I've never read Proust, and I'm afraid to a little bit because I think I have a deep nostalgia for childhood, and I have a feeling that if I read that, I'm going to want to write realistically about my childhood, which really is not. I don't want to, so I've been kind of stepping around that one a little bit, but.
Just to make a little connection for our listeners, future guest on the show, Edward Packard, one of his 3 most formative books is In Search of Lost Time by Proust. Now, he is 90, so you got some decades still there for that one. And then finally, this conversation, George, has just been like a real gold mine. So many nuggets of wisdom. I mean that deeply. I will.
Thank you.
No, I'm going to listen to this over and over again as inspiration for me as an artist, as a writer, and I hope it does the same for so many people. You have done it, and you're doing it, and I know you're going to continue to do it for a long time. What you are producing and creating with your words is magical, and when I read your writing, it really does send me totally somewhere else. I wonder if you could close us off today with a final thought or piece of hard-fought wisdom for everybody out there listening, aspiring to be a better writer.
I mean, this is really pedestrian, but I think for me, a big trick was to recognize that the whole key was in rewriting, not in what you put down initially, because that's too hard. It's too much pressure to be brilliant the first time. But if you can nurture in yourself, a lot of kind of discernment or taste about what you like to see in your prose, and then let that come out through revision. That's kind of this amazing superpower, because you never are held captive by the first draft. There's always hope, even if it's not good on draft 80, it might be good on 82. And it made the whole thing a little more generous and open instead of kind of fear-based. And, if I fail at writing, what will I do? It's like, well, actually, you never really fail until you quit. And in that mode, you've got a kind of a self-generosity that makes it leads you in the direction of fun and away from the direction of panic, which I think is, the reader can probably feel that on the other end.
Ah, beautiful word. I love that. You never really fail until you quit. George Saunders, thank you so much for adjusting your spigot towards our listeners and all of the Three Books community today. I really appreciate it.
I love talking to you, Neil. You got a great mind. Thank you so much.
He is such a generous spirit. You'd be embarrassed to behave in a small way around him. That is a quote about George Saunders, said by Tobias Wolff. And I felt that way around George. Did you? Was your heart kind of opening up with him? Were you just sort of lapping up all the wisdom and little tiny pearls he was just tossing down around us? I just feel so lucky and touched that we got to have that time with George. Thank you so much to George for coming on Three Books. How many quotes jumped out to you? Did you take notes? Did you hit rewind a few times? I've listened to that conversation probably 4 times already. I just keep listening to it because more and more things keep popping out. And George has such a humble and generous and soft-spoken mannerism, but the ideas he's presenting are very complex. So I find that I need to sort of almost gestate on them a little bit, or roll them around in my palms a little bit, because there's a lot there. I had trouble narrowing it down to 3 quotes, but let me give it a shot. How about this one? The reading project is a life project. Very simple, just a 7-word sentence, but what a gift to think of reading as something that you just are always doing, that you're always practicing. Very Buddhist, maybe you might say that George is saying it from that perspective. And also, the other thing I take from this quote, the reading project is a life project, is I like thinking, as Anne Bogle reminded us in chapter 58 of Three Books, when we talked about a reading life, it's like no matter how crappy your day is going, and I have crappy days, just like you have crappy days. We all do, where you get yelled at, or you get into a fight with a partner or a child. You don't get anything done when you had a big, long to-do list, or you feel ineffective at your job. Like we're all there sometimes. But how relieving is it to think of the fact that you also are carrying with you an invisible reading life at the same time, somewhere high above your head, somewhere around your body, maybe somewhere in your aura, your atmosphere. And you can go back to that place too. And I love thinking of that. Sometimes my real life is going fantastic. My real life is going fantastic, but my reading life is kind of crappy. Like I'm can't find a great book, or I'm not falling into anything, or I've started 12 books and I can't get into whatever. But the other times it can happen the other way. And I just mention that because I want us to think of our reading lives as these other places that we get to be together. And so part of what hopefully we can do with Three Books is we can keep encouraging and building and shaping and guiding each other through each other's invisible worlds. Okay. I know I'm getting a bit lofty now, but let me just say that. Okay. Number 2, the way your parents make you feel as a kid is the way that you then assume the universe must be. And while all the parents out there take a gasp at how kind of maybe pressure-inducing that sounds, don't forget, George also said, this is a little suffix on part 2, on quote 2, he said, the world is corrective. Remember, he said, what you don't teach your kids, the world will. And so can we carry both those ideas together? Both the idea that as parents, perhaps, or as children, definitely in some sense, the way your parents make you feel as a kid is the way that you then assume the universe must be. Wonderful, endless love and so on makes you feel powerful and that you can do anything, let's say. But also the world is corrective. So, hey, parents, don't worry, because whatever you're not doing or whatever you're doing wrong, hey, the world will hopefully chime in helpfully to give a little boost there. Okay. And the third and final quote, yes, I am counting those past 2 as one, is you're inside a temporary phenomenon that has tendencies. Again, simple, but packed with power. You are inside a temporary phenomenon that has tendencies. Don't forget that. Notice them, feel them, observe them, challenge them, harness them, but also remember that and let that be a stress-relieving thought. Okay? That's how I read it myself. Thank you so much to George Saunders for giving us 3 more books to add to our top 1,000. For any new listeners, just remember that you can go to 3books.co/the top 1,000 to hear or actually read a list of every single formative book ever mentioned on the show thus far. We are in the 700s, guys. We started in the 900s, then 800s. Now we are number 780. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Number 779, Haji Murat, Murad, or a T, depending on which version you have, by Leo Tolstoy, Tolstoy. And number 778, Europeana by Patrick Rednick. My huge, wonderful, again, gratitude to George, to you, to all 3 bookers out there for listening to this conversation. Thank you so much. And now, are you still here? Are you still listening? If so, I want to welcome you back to the end of the podcast club. Yes, this is one of 3 clubs that we have for 3 Books listeners, including the Cover to Cover Club, which are people that listen to every single chapter of 3 books for 333 straight lunar cycles, and the Secret Club. And I can't tell you more about the Secret Club other than the fact that it is analog only, okay? And to get a clue for how to join, you got to call our phone number, 1-833-READ-A-LOT. And you can drop that superfluous T if it is giving you pesky trouble on your phone. 1-833-READ-A-LOT is our phone number. And let's start the end of the podcast club as we always do by going to the phones.
Hi, Neil. My name is Jose. I am calling from Columbus, Georgia. And I just wanted to tell you that my girlfriend showed me your podcast, and it's absolutely amazing. Shout out to her. My girlfriend's name is Vanessa. She's amazing. And honestly, this podcast has really, really, really just given me a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to enjoy. I love the community. For those of you out there, this has been just something really cool that made it feel like, I don't know, everybody who loves books is staying together and reading. And before, I used to not read as much, and now I read a lot more. I just want you to know, thank you, Neil. This is an amazing podcast. And I did want to ask if, whenever you're doing your interviews, do you ever feel like sometimes you don't agree with the person that you're sitting in front of? Maybe not everyone, but I do wonder if some of the podcasts are not your favorite, or if the person that you're talking to, it's a little hard to speak to them. So sometimes we deliberate whether you like a podcast more than the other, and I just wanted to get your feel on that. Thanks. Once again, my name is Jose, and I'm calling from Georgia, and I just want you to know, hey, man, I really love what you're doing, and you are totally amazing. Thanks again.
Thank you so much to Jose from Columbus, Georgia. And shout out to your girlfriend, Vanessa, Jose. Thank you for introducing you to 3 books. What's interesting about your question. I mean, of course, is the answer, because I'm a human who has tendencies, right? I'm living in a machine that has tendencies. And so, of course, I have that reaction. I'm sure you probably heard that in many interviews where I'm like talking to Jen Egg is somebody who comes to mind. At the same time, I will say 2 things. Number one is when I find my own ideas pushed or provoked, or my tendencies or my biases or my privileges, kind of rattling inside me, I'm trying to recognize that those uncomfortable feelings are healthy signs of both growth at minimum, right? Because I'm learning something new, which is why it's interesting, which is why it's challenging, and potentially expanding. So, expanding meaning I become a bigger, hopefully wider, hopefully deeper, hopefully richer person as a result of having new thoughts come to me. So that's one thing I wanted to say, is that I seek out kind of incongruent thoughts. Ideally, I would like to have even more on my show. It's hard too, though, because then people sometimes will accuse you of giving a platform or a voice to voices that they don't think should have a platform. And I wrestle with that, because actually I don't see it that way. The way I see it is human. I see us as human beings. And I think the longer you spend with somebody, the more you love them. So for those of you who listened to 3 books since the beginning, well, I feel probably a deeper level of love than someone who listens to 15 minutes of one episode. No offense to that person, and that's wonderful, and it's great, and it's a wonderful little way to connect. But I'm just saying, time is an ingredient to love, and so when I, for example, met the teenage Mormon missionaries on the street, I recognized that my biases were like, well, I don't really like I don't know Mormonism. All I know is it's a musical, and like they have lots of kids, and they believe in something that I don't think is true. Like, what's the deal? And I just recognized right away that those thoughts were like, whoa, those thoughts are like pretty simple and definitely not complex and definitely not true. Like I recognize that. So I leaned into that with the interview, and the pretense I came to the interview with is let's understand these human beings. And of course, when I do, we fall in love. I mean, we were holding, literally, I was holding hands with them by the end of it. We were crying with each other. I mean, that I think is the potential of connection that all of us have with all of us, you know? So I am not going to pay that much attention to the worry of giving platform to voices that should not be amplified. Instead, I hope to seek out humanity in all shapes, sizes, and forms, as wide as and as diverse as possible, in the hopes of expanding myself and all of you through the conversations. Okay, I hope that answers your question. You're probably like, I thought about it a little bit more than I wanted him to. Jose, thank you so much for calling in. Okay, so now we go to the letter of the chapter. Yeah, so I guess this time I kind of got to do 2 letters, because I got to continue that letter I began in the introduction that I would promise, and at the same time, I also promised last chapter that I would get back to y'all about the great Gong Debate, or rather, you were going to get back to me on whether you like the gong or not. If you don't know what I'm talking about, listen to chapter 74 and 73, because the Gong Debate kind of rages up to now. I feel like I got to do both. Okay, so let's continue the letter that I began at the beginning. First, the author's name, and she's told me she's fine with me sharing her name. She's given me her permission. Her name is Jen, and her last name is Penn, Penn, from Sandwich, Illinois. Jen, thank you so much for your letter, and here is the other half of it. Okay. Please permit me to share 2 recommendations. The first is to better define terms. For example, I was applauding you when you asked Debbie Stoller to define feminism. She, of course, is the editor of Bust magazine, the largest feminist magazine in the world. But then later with Juniper Fitzgerald, former sex worker down in Omaha, used feminism again. But it didn't seem that Juniper's definition was the same. Later, Jen Egg offered her perspective on feminism. But I think these 3 women had slightly different spins on the term feminism, and so it would have been helpful to establish a baseline. Yeah, thank you. Really, really good point. I will endeavor to do better at that. At the same time, sometimes I'm looking at the clock, and then I'm like, do listeners want to hear a third definition of feminism if I only have 7 minutes left? That's the kind of stuff I'm also thinking about. Not to say that your point isn't super awesome, which it is. Okay, my other nugget is sometimes you speak over your guests. I appreciate your enthusiasm and your excitement, but there are times when your poor guest can't finish a thought without interruption. For example, in chapter 44 with Kevin, the bookseller, sometimes he was in the middle of a sentence and you made a statement to interrupt him, to divert the topic to something that came to your mind rather than the direction Kevin might have been headed, to talk about a speech you gave or a book, etc., etc. Okay, I was really interested in hearing Kevin, but I felt cheated. God, can you hear the shame in my voice? I'm feeling shame about this. This occurs in other chapters as well. I understand that there are common threads that you can tie among guests, and you're referencing other chapters is exactly what led me to other chapters, but could there be a balance? It reminds me of a Plato quote. Wise people speak because they have something to say. Fools because they have to say something. You are a wise guy, Neil. In brackets, meant in the most complimentary way, as opposed to me being a member of the mafia. Now, I also want to tell you, I have come across 2 guests that I think you should have on the podcast. Number 1 is Alan Jacobs, who wrote the book, The Pleasures of Reading in an Age of Distraction. And number 2 is Sarah Mackenzie, who is from the Read Aloud Revival, an advocate for reading aloud in families to kids of all ages. Oh, fascinating. Okay, cool. And she also brought Dr. John Hutton to my awareness. He is with Reading and Literacy Center at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And he talks about how reading affects the brain. Okay, guys. Let's add Alan Jacobs, Sarah Mackenzie, and Dr. John Hutton to the pitch list, okay? So we're going to do that. Those three people all sound fascinating. Finally, I'd like to share a title of a book with you. It's called The Rights of the Reader, which came out in France in 1992. It contains Pennock's Rights of the Reader. And she says, Neil, these are in alignment with 3 books' values. They are. Are you guys ready? I'm going to read 10 readers' rights right now. This is a sub-point within this letter, this epic letter. Okay. According to The Rights of the Reader, a French publication from 1992 by Daniel Pennock, the reader has, number 1, the right to not read. Number 2, the right to skip. Number 3, the right to not finish a book. Quit more to read more is our first value. Love this. 4, the right to read it again. Yes. 5, the right to read anything. Yes. No book shame, no book guilt. 6, the right to mistake a book for real life. In brackets, a textually transmitted disease. Yes. Beautiful. Your reading life. We're talking about that. Number 7, the right to read anywhere. Number 8, the right to dip in. Oh, yeah, I needed that one. That's good. The right to dip in, because you know what? I was feeling guilt actually the other day because I had like 10 books on the go and I'm like, 20 pages into all of them. And I feel like I'm walking through quicksand and I felt bad about myself for not kind of focusing on a book. But that's so true, guys. We're going to add that to the values right now. Readers have the right to dip in. Yes. The right to read out aloud, of course, and the right to be quiet. Of course. I felt like the last 2 were kind of obvious, but maybe they were trying to get to 10. I don't know. I could go on with more, but I will spare you and close. I know this letter is long, so thanks for indulging me. I am pacing myself on the rest of the chapters because I don't want to run out, and I have to wait for the next one to drop. It is so hard to exercise that restraint. Keep up the great work from Jen Penn from Sandwich, Illinois. P.S. My 3 most formative books are The Book of the Dun Cow by Walter Wangerin, Wangerin. Number 2, The Book of Joy, Dalai Lama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Okay, isn't it funny? The Book of the Dun Cow, The Book of Joy. I know you guys might be expecting The Book of Awesome here, but it's not. It's number 3, Wednesday Wars and Okay for Now by Gary Schmidt. I guess I could have said The Book of Mormon if I was less arrogant. Or hubristic, is that a word? Did I make that up? Maybe. Thank you so much, Jen. Please drop me a line. I will be mailing you a book because you just sent me a book. Thank you so much for this letter. Now, I got to get back to the great Gong Debate here. I know we're running a bit long. Let me know, guys. Do you like long end of the podcast club or should I tighten them up? I do not know how you feel. 1-833 read a lot, or leave me a review on iTunes and say in your review whether or not you think the end of the podcast club is too long. Long reviews, as you can tell, and long letters, very welcome. Okay, Melanie Waters says, I associate a gong with gong show, and I can't take it seriously. Also, when I worked at a radio station, I bought a gong, and we used it when in jest to complain about management. So I guess it always has negative connotations to me. Okay. When she said negative cognitions to me, I read connotations. Negative cognitions. I like that phrase. That's cool. Let's see. Who else? Ooh, I find the gong is a bit jarring. It disrupts the flow of the conversation and jerks you out of the moment. Okay, got a lot like that. Kind of like just don't like the jarringness. Carol Jarker expanded a little bit more. A huge thumbs down emoji on the gong. It is a big distraction from the conversation and the beautiful flow you have with your guests. You don't need sound effects, Neil. You've got the real thing going in your podcasts. Thank you, Carol. And then over on iTunes. And again, I love feedback on the show through the reviews. Like you can leave a review and then get back to me. So leave me a review and let me know what you think. Okay. Try not to get too extrinsic focused. Do love reviews at the same time. Zinnia Sky on Apple Podcasts in the United States of America says on March 13th, 2021, time spent listening to Neil is a time well spent. 5 stars. 5 stars. Time spent listening to Neil is time well spent. Love everything about this show except the gong. Oh my God. I'm actually kind of glad the feedback from you all was so unanimous. Like imagine it was 50-50. In this case, it was everyone against me. And you know what? I'd revert to the crowd. If I feel hard and fast about something, I will tell you guys, like I did with the theme song. I want it to be long. I want us to center ourselves. I want us to ground ourselves. I want us to sink into the moment together, the space that we make together. That's the point of it. But so I was hard and fast on that one. I could be still a bit weird on it, but I'm hard and fast. This one I said, you guys let me know about the gong. And did you notice with George, there was no gong? Because I knew this was coming. I'd been getting your letters the last couple weeks. I'm waiting for the moon to go so the letters might stop. Thank you seriously, though, for your feedback. It is very, very much appreciated. Okay, now we got to get to the word of the chapter. I want you to buckle up right now, people, okay? Put the seatbelt on. Put your goggles on, maybe an N95 on the front of your face. You are going to get word clouded. Are you ready for this? Here we go.
Zhivago-esque winter finger in the dike things, sensory apparatus, Darwinian miracle, kind of a distortive, diluted state. The aforementioned duck can, disavow inchoate motion. Doesn't have these sort of defects. Low randomness in a story, implicit in the bargain. With iteration, very fastidiously more stooped. What I call in the book micro choices. That's contingent. Justice Spigot, suite of feelings, decorative or trivial. Stark relief, really harrowing. It's good fodder, mimic anything that sublime. Your monkey mind starts ruminating, sometimes castigating yourself. Have it viscerally yet. This metaphysical story, your normal stance, and so impassioned. All this accruing of wealth is kind of compensatory, if you have any semblance of taste, by neurotically bewailing my own constriction. Hyperbolic quality, sacramental function, come out kind of elated. Buddhist impermanence to wallow in. Satirical, snarky, agitated, and distraught. Have a little more discernment. Cannibalistic and writerly compression or the sort of summation are really reminiscent, holographic distillation, third-person omniscient. We commiserate, access that valence constitutes the asymmetry. It never flinches, and it never conventionalizes eugenics experiments. So it's kind of a really great sort of palate cleanser. Toxicity of our time. I mean, this is really pedestrian.
Wow. Are you still here? Did you get word clouded off your chair there? Holy cow, George. You did, you just dropped the mic on the word cloud history of 3 books. I mean, I think chapter 58 with David Mitchell was up there, certainly maybe close. But either way, we just got word clouded. Our faces just got word clouded off. I mean, so many words to choose from there. Really hard not to pick. Like the one I was gonna pick is inchoate, Inchoate. Like he said, it would be a blaze of inchoate motion. Inchoate. Did you guys know what that word was?
Inchoate.
Just begin and not so fully formed or developed, rudimentary. But I'm not going to pick it. I know I just played the voice. I'm not going to pick it. Instead, I'm going to pick spigot.
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 S-P-I-G-O-T. Noun. Very interesting, guys. 2 definitions. First one is a small peg or plug, especially for insertion into the vent of a cask. Okay. I did not know that because I was using it, or I guess I thought George meant it in the sense of number 2. The second noun definition, though, is only used in the United States. A faucet. Spigot means faucet in the United States, and I guess Southern Canada, apparently. What did you think spigot was? I'm very curious if we were way off, or maybe he meant it in the first and I took it to mean the second. The origin of this word is very interesting. It actually comes from the late 14th century from Old French, espigot, E-S-P-I-G-O-T. So really the same word with an E at the beginning, espigot or a spigot. And what that meant was the core of a fruit, comma, a small ear of grain. That is fascinating. So think about the fact that, 700 years ago when they needed to plug an old cask of mead, you grabbed a peach pit there and you stuffed it in, espigot, a pit, a small core of a fruit. Next time you hear spigot, picture a peach pit, or if you're in the States, picture a faucet. Thank you to all of you 3 bookers for aiming your spigots together with me and George and everybody else around the world listening together. It was wonderful to spend time with all of you. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, remember that you are what you eat and you are what you read. Keep turning that page, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.